Good evening and welcome to Embers and Pages, where we retell the world's most beautiful stories in a voice meant for rest. How are you tonight? I hope the day treated you gently. If your mind feels cluttered with what needs doing, with what went wrong or what lies ahead, let those thoughts drift away now. You found your way here to this quiet corner, and here we rest. We let the world fall silent. We find peace in the company of dreamers. If you're new to this channel, welcome. If you've returned, thank you for trusting us with your rest once more. A gentle reminder, if this story brings you comfort, consider leaving a like, sharing it with someone who might need a softer place to land, or leaving a comment about which story you'd like us to tell next. Your presence here, your rest, matters to us. Tonight, we journey into the dusty roads and golden plains of Spain to meet one of literature's most tender dreamers. We are stepping into Don Quixote, Miguel de Cervantes' aching, beautiful tale of imagination and idealism. This is a story about a man who refused to accept the world as it was, who saw castles where others saw inns, who saw giants where others saw windmills. It's a story of chivalry and folly, of loyal friendship, of believing so fiercely in something better that reality itself begins to shimmer. At its heart, it's about the courage it takes to dream. Before we begin, let's settle in. Dim your lights or turn them off entirely if you wish. Lower the volume until it's just barely audible, so you must lean into the quiet, and your mind has nowhere to go but rest. Find the position that welcomes sleep most easily. Let your shoulders drop, let your jaw unclench, pull your blanket close. Close your eyes when you're ready, breathe slowly, in through your nose, out through your mouth. Let each exhale carry away a little more tension. You don't need to stay awake for the whole story. This isn't a test. If you drift away halfway through, if you float into sleep during a windmill or a dusty road, or a quiet conversation between a knight and his squire, that's exactly right. The story will be here tomorrow. Tonight, the only thing asked of you is rest. Our story begins on a dry, sunlit plain in the region of La Mancha, Spain, where an aging gentleman sits surrounded by books, his mind ablaze with tales of knights and quests, not yet knowing that his imagination is about to carry him, and us, into one of the most gentle, beautiful, bittersweet adventures ever told. In a village of La Mancha, in a time not so different from our own in its weariness and routine, there lived a gentleman whose name is lost to us. Though some say it was Quixote, or perhaps Quesada, it matters little now. What matters is this: he was a man of about 50 years, lean and weathered, a lover of books, and a keeper of dreams in a world that had little patience for dreaming. His house was simple. The rooms held the usual things: old furniture, a modest library, a few family heirlooms gathering dust. He lived quietly with his niece and his housekeeper and a boy who helped in the stables. His life followed the rhythm of the Spanish countryside, the heat of summer, the rains of spring, the unchanging passage of days. He was not wealthy, but neither was he poor. He was, by all accounts, unremarkable, except for one thing. He read not practical books, not ledgers or treatises on agriculture or law. No, he read tales of chivalry, stories of knights in gleaming armor, of dragons slain and maidens rescued, of honor and valor, and quests that stretched across kingdoms. He read until his eyes ached, until the candles burned to nubs, until the words on the page seemed more real than the walls around him. He read of Amadis of Gaul, the perfect knight whose deeds shone like sunlight on water. He read of Palmerin of England, of Turrentlow Blanche, of knights who crossed deserts and seas to right wrongs and defend the helpless. He read of enchantments and magic swords, of giants defeated and kingdoms saved. The stories piled higher on his desk, spilled onto the floor, filled every corner of his mind. His niece worried. His housekeeper scolded. The village priest visited and suggested, gently, that perhaps these books were not the best use of time. But our gentleman barely heard them. When they spoke, he nodded politely, but his mind was already back in those pages, riding alongside his heroes through imagined landscapes. The more he read, the more the world outside his window began to lose its color. The fields seemed dull. The conversations at the market felt hollow. What were grain prices or village gossip compared to the deeds of Amadis of Gaul or the adventures of Palmerin of England? Those knights lived, they mattered. They transformed the world with their courage. And slowly, idea by idea, page by page, something shifted in the gentleman's mind. He began to believe that the world of knights had not passed away. It had simply been forgotten. Someone needed to remember. Someone needed to bring back honor, justice, the protection of the weak, the righting of wrongs. Someone needed to be a knight-errant once more. Why not him? The thought, once planted, grew roots. It tangled through his imagination like ivy until he could not pull it free, and more importantly, until he no longer wanted to. Yes, he would do it. He would become a knight. It made perfect sense to him. The world was full of injustice, full of people who needed help. Maidens were in distress. Villains roamed freely. Giants terrorized the countryside. Who else would stop them if not a knight? And if there were no knights left, then he would simply have to become one. The decision, once made, filled him with a purpose he had not felt in decades. His steps grew lighter. His eyes brightened. He no longer felt like a man of 50 with aching joints and fading sight. He felt like a man on the verge of greatness. But first, preparations. A knight needed armor. He searched his house and found, in a dusty corner, a suit of armor that had belonged to his great-grandfather. It was old, tarnished, incomplete. The helmet was missing its visor. The metal was pocked with rust. Some pieces were missing entirely. But he saw it not as it was, but as it could be. He spent days cleaning it, polishing it with rags and oil until the metal began to show something like a shine. He fashioned a new visor out of pasteboard and strips of iron, working carefully, patiently, speaking to the armor as though it could hear him. "You and I," he told the breastplate, "are going to do great things." When he tested the visor with a single blow of his sword, it shattered instantly, the pasteboard crumpling like paper. He stared at the pieces for a long moment. Then he made another visor, this time reinforcing it differently. And this time he chose not to test it. Faith, he decided, was more reliable than experimentation. If he believed the visor would hold, then it would hold. That was how these things worked. A knight needed a horse. He had one, a skinny, aging nag that had seen better years, a horse so bony and tired that it seemed barely capable of carrying a man across a field, let alone into battle. Its ribs showed through its coat. Its eyes were patient and dull. It had not been ridden hard in years, if ever. But our gentleman looked at this horse and saw nobility. He saw a steed worthy of legend, a companion who would carry him into history. He spent an entire afternoon thinking of names, rejecting each one until he found the right one, Rocinante. The name suggested strength, history, and destiny. It suggested a horse that had once been something and would be again. The horse, for its part, continued to look as it always had, old, thin, and entirely uninterested in destiny. A knight needed a lady to serve. Every tale made that clear. A knight's heart must belong to someone pure, distant, inspiring, someone whose beauty and virtue would guide him through his trials. Our gentleman thought of the women he knew in the village, and one came to mind, a farm girl from a nearby hamlet called El Toboso. Her name was Aldonza Lorenzo. She was sturdy and practical, with strong hands and little patience for foolishness. He had perhaps spoken to her twice in his life, and both times the conversations had been brief and unremarkable. But he did not see her as she was. He saw her as she could be in his imagination. He saw a lady of unparalleled beauty and grace, a woman whose very name could inspire acts of courage. He gave her a new name, one that sang with romance and mystery, Dulcinea del Toboso. She became the lady of his heart, the one for whom he would perform great deeds, the one whose favor he would seek, though she would never know it. In his mind, Dulcinea was perfect. She had golden hair and eyes like stars. She moved with the grace of a queen. Her voice was music. Her virtue was unmatched. That this image had nothing to do with the real Aldonza Lorenzo did not trouble him. In fact, it never even occurred to him. The Dulcinea in his mind was real. She was true, and that was enough. And finally, he needed a name for himself. His own name, whatever it had been, felt too small, too tied to his old life of routine and quiet. He needed something grand, something that announced his purpose to the world. He needed a name that would be remembered. He thought for days, turning names over in his mind like stones. He tried various combinations, testing how they sounded when spoken aloud. And at last, after much deliberation, he found it, Don Quixote de la Mancha. It had the weight of legend. It had the rhythm of greatness. It had the sound of a man who mattered, a man who would be written about in books just like the ones he had read. Don Quixote de la Mancha. Yes, that was who he was now. Everything was ready. His armor gleamed, or at least it gleamed as much as old metal could. His horse stood in the stable, looking no more or less enthusiastic than usual. His lady existed in his mind, radiant and perfect. His name had been chosen. On a hot July morning, before dawn, before his niece or housekeeper could wake and stop him, Don Quixote dressed himself in his armor. It was heavier than he had anticipated, and the helmet sat awkwardly on his head, pressing down in uncomfortable ways. The joints creaked when he moved, but he did not care. Discomfort was part of the knightly life. Sacrifice was necessary. He crept to the stable and saddled Rocinante, who shifted beneath the weight with the weariness of a creature who wanted only to be left in peace. He took up his lance, which was really just an old spear he had found in the barn, and his shield, which was scratched and dented but serviceable. And then, without a word to anyone, without a plan or a map or even a clear idea of where he was going, Don Quixote rode out of his village and into the wide, waiting world. The sun rose over the plains of La Mancha, golden and indifferent. The sky stretched wide and pale. The air was dry and still, scented faintly with dust and wild herbs. The road stretched before him, rutted and ordinary, the same road farmers used to take their goods to market. But in Don Quixote's heart, everything was transformed. The road was not a road, it was the beginning of an adventure. The dry plains were not empty, they were full of possibility, full of hidden dangers and secret wonders. And he was not an aging man in rusty armor on a weary horse. He was a knight, a defender of the weak, a seeker of justice, a man with a purpose, and the world, whether it knew it or not, was about to meet him. Don Quixote rode through that first day with his heart singing. The world had never looked so beautiful to him. The dusty plains of La Mancha, which he had seen 1,000 times in his ordinary life, now seemed charged with meaning. Every rock could hide a mystery. Every hill could conceal an adventure. Every distant dust cloud could be a sign of someone in need. Rocinante plodded along at a pace that could charitably be called unhurried. The sun climbed higher, then began its slow descent. Don Quixote's armor grew hot, then hotter still. Sweat trickled down his back. His legs ached from the saddle. His stomach growled. He had left without provisions, without even a crust of bread. But these discomforts seemed small, even noble. Knights endured hardship. It was part of the calling. As evening approached, he began to feel the first stirrings of uncertainty. Where exactly was he going? What precisely was his first quest meant to be? In the books, adventures seemed to find knights naturally, as though fate arranged them. But so far, the landscape had offered nothing but silence and scrub grass. And then, just as the sun touched the horizon, he saw it, a small inn squatting beside the road. To you or me, it would have looked like what it was, a modest roadside inn, the kind where travelers stopped to water their horses and eat a simple meal. Its walls were whitewashed and cracking. Its roof was tile, patched in places. A few chickens scratched in the yard. Smoke rose from a chimney. It was humble, unremarkable, and entirely ordinary. But Don Quixote did not see an inn. He saw a castle. Of course he did. The towers, what were clearly just the corners of the building, rose nobly against the sky. The drawbridge, really just a wooden door, stood ready to be lowered. The pennants, in reality, probably just laundry drying on a line, fluttered in the breeze. It was perfect. His first castle. 2 women stood near the entrance, probably servants or perhaps travelers themselves. They looked tired, their dresses worn and simple. But Don Quixote saw maidens of high birth, ladies of refinement, taking their ease in the courtyard of their lord's fortress. When he approached, removing his helmet with great ceremony, the women stared. They did not know whether to laugh or run. This strange, thin man in ill-fitting armor, sitting on a horse that looked ready to collapse, speaking to them in flowery, ancient phrases. It was absurd. It was alarming. It was certainly unexpected. Don Quixote addressed them with the utmost courtesy. He begged their forgiveness for his travel-stained appearance. He asked if the lord of the castle was in residence, as he had urgent need to request the hospitality due to a wandering knight. The women exchanged glances. One of them giggled nervously. At that moment, the innkeeper appeared, a practical, round-faced man with little patience for nonsense. But when he saw Don Quixote, something in his expression softened. Perhaps it was pity, perhaps it was amusement, perhaps it was simple kindness. Whatever the reason, he decided to play along. "Welcome, Sir Knight," the innkeeper said, bowing slightly. "My castle is at your service." Don Quixote's face lit with gratitude. He dismounted, awkwardly, nearly falling, and tried to remove his armor. It did not come off easily. The straps had been tied in haste and were now stuck. The helmet would not lift off. He stood there, ridiculous and struggling, while the innkeeper and the women tried to help. Eventually, they managed to free him from the worst of it, though he insisted on keeping some pieces on. A knight, he explained, must always be ready for battle. They brought him food, bread, olives, a bit of dried fish. To Don Quixote, it was a feast fit for nobility. He ate with solemn reverence, describing the meal as though it were delicacies from a royal table. The innkeeper watched, half entertained, half concerned. As the evening deepened, Don Quixote explained his predicament. He was a knight-errant, he said, traveling the world to do good and right wrongs. But there was one problem: he had never been formally knighted. The oversight troubled him. Without the proper ceremony, was he truly a knight? Could his deeds count? The innkeeper, entering into the spirit of the thing, offered to perform the ceremony himself. Why not? It would be a story to tell, at least. And so, in the courtyard of the inn, beneath a sky full of stars, the innkeeper arranged a makeshift knighting. He had Don Quixote kneel. He placed a hand on his shoulder. He intoned solemn-sounding phrases he made up on the spot, borrowing half-remembered bits from stories he had heard as a child. One of the women held Don Quixote's sword. The chickens wandered nearby, indifferent. When it was done, the innkeeper pronounced him a knight. Don Quixote rose, his eyes shining. He felt it now, the weight of the title, the responsibility. He was no longer just a man pretending. He was truly, officially, a knight. He thanked the innkeeper with profound sincerity. He bowed to the women, whom he still believed were noble ladies. And then he asked if there were any quests nearby that required his attention, any wrongs to right, any dangers to face. The innkeeper, wisely, said that all was peaceful at the moment. Don Quixote accepted this, though he seemed faintly disappointed. He spent the night at the inn, his castle, sleeping restlessly, his mind full of dreams of glory. The next morning he set out again. He had not gone far when he encountered a farmer beating a young servant boy who had supposedly let some sheep wander off. The boy was crying, pleading, but the farmer was unmoved. Don Quixote saw injustice. He saw a villain and a victim. Without hesitation, he rode forward and commanded the farmer to stop. The farmer, startled by this bizarre figure on horseback, did stop. Don Quixote lectured him on honor and fairness, insisting that the boy be treated justly. The farmer, eager to get rid of this madman, agreed to everything. Don Quixote, satisfied, rode away, certain he had done a great good. Unfortunately, as soon as Don Quixote was out of sight, the farmer resumed the beating with even more vigor, angry now at the interruption. The boy, if anything, was worse off than before, but Don Quixote did not know this. He rode on, filled with the satisfaction of a quest completed. Not long after, he encountered a group of merchants on the road. They were ordinary men, traveling to a nearby city to sell their goods. But Don Quixote, caught up in the fever of his new identity, decided they needed to be tested. He blocked their path and demanded that they acknowledge the beauty of his lady, Dulcinea del Toboso. They must swear, he insisted, that she is the most beautiful woman in the world, sight unseen. The merchants were baffled. Who was this lunatic? What was he talking about? One of them, more amused than annoyed, asked to see a picture of the lady in question. Surely, if she was so beautiful, Don Quixote would have some token, some portrait. Don Quixote was offended. Faith, he declared, did not require proof. They must simply believe. The merchants, losing patience, tried to move past him. Don Quixote, enraged by their lack of chivalry, charged at them with his lance. It did not go well. Rocinante stumbled. Don Quixote fell hard onto the road, his armor clattering, his lance splintering. The merchant's servants, annoyed and perhaps a bit vindictive, gave him a few kicks as they passed. Then they left him there, groaning on the ground. Eventually, a neighbor from his village, A farmer who recognized him despite the armor came along and found him. With great effort, the farmer loaded Don Quixote onto a donkey and took him home. When they arrived at the village, his niece and housekeeper were beside themselves with worry and anger. Where had he been? What had he done to himself? They put him to bed, scolding and fussing. While Don Quixote slept, feverish and rambling about giants and castles, his friends held a council. The village priest and the barber gathered with the niece and housekeeper. They agreed those books were to blame. Those cursed books had filled his head with nonsense. And so, in an act they believed was merciful, they entered his library. They gathered the books, those tales of chivalry he had loved so dearly, and carried them into the yard. They burned them. Every single one. The pages curled and blackened. The words turned to ash. The stories that had filled Don Quixote's mind, that had given him purpose and joy, rose as smoke into the sky and disappeared. When Don Quixote woke days later, weak but recovering, he asked for his books. His niece lied gently. She told him an enchanter had come and taken them away, spirited them off in a cloud of smoke. The room where the library had been was now walled up, she said. It had never existed. Don Quixote, still caught in his dreaming mind, believed her. Of course, enchanters were powerful. They were jealous of knights. It made perfect sense. And so ended his first sally into the world, with bruises, disillusionment, and a library turned to ash. But if his friends thought this would cure him, they were wrong. The dream had taken root too deeply. And soon, very soon, Don Quixote would ride out again. Don Quixote spent 2 weeks recovering in his bed, his body mending slowly, his mind not mending at all. If anything, the dream burned brighter. He lay there staring at the ceiling, replaying his adventures, reframing his defeats as victories. The merchants had been cowardly. The farmer would surely have honored his word. The innkeeper's castle had been splendid. Everything in his memory took on a golden glow. His niece brought him broth and worried. His housekeeper changed his bandages and muttered prayers. The village priest visited and spoke gently about rest and reason. But Don Quixote heard none of it, not really. His mind was already back on the road, already planning his next adventure. But he also recognized in his own way that something had been missing. In all the great tales, knights had squires, loyal companions who carried their supplies, tended their wounds, and provided fellowship on long journeys. A squire was not just a servant, but a friend, a witness to the knight's deeds, someone to share in the glory. Don Quixote had gone out alone, and perhaps that had been his mistake. A knight needed a squire. And so, as soon as he could walk without wincing, he began to think of who that squire might be. It needed to be someone loyal, someone honest, someone who would not mock his dreams or try to talk him out of his calling. Most of the men in the village were too practical, too bound by reason and routine. They would never understand. But then his mind turned to a man he knew from the village, a farmer, a neighbor, a man so ordinary that he seemed almost invisible. His name was Sancho Panza. He was short and round where Don Quixote was tall and thin. His belly hung over his belt. His face was ruddy from sun and work. He was practical where Don Quixote was idealistic, grounded where Don Quixote soared. He had a wife and children, and a small plot of land that yielded just enough to keep them fed. He had never read a book in his life, and had no particular ambitions beyond getting through each day with enough to eat and a bit of peace. In other words, he was the last person anyone would expect to go on a quest. But Don Quixote saw potential. He saw loyalty, simplicity, and an honest heart. Sancho did not overthink things. He did not question too deeply. He was the kind of man who, if he gave his word, would keep it. And more than that, Don Quixote had a plan to convince him. One evening, as the sun began to set and the fields turned gold, Don Quixote approached Sancho as he was finishing his work. Sancho was untying his oxen from the plough, wiping sweat from his forehead, looking forward to supper and rest. When Don Quixote appeared, still moving a bit stiffly from his injuries, Sancho greeted him politely but warily. The whole village had heard about Don Quixote's strange journey. Some laughed, some pitied, some simply shook their heads and moved on with their lives. Don Quixote wasted no time with pleasantries. He spoke of adventure and honor, of righting wrongs and defending the helpless. He painted a picture of the open road, of dawn breaking over unknown hills, of noble deeds that would be remembered for generations. He spoke of a life that mattered, a life that meant something beyond the turning of seasons and the tilling of soil. Sancho listened, leaning against his plow, skeptical but curious. It sounded wonderful, of course. It also sounded insane. And then Don Quixote made his offer. If Sancho would agree to be his squire, to accompany him on his quests, then Don Quixote would make him rich. Not immediately, of course. These things took time. But eventually. When Don Quixote conquered an island, as knights often did in the stories, he would make Sancho its governor. Sancho Panza, governor of an island. Imagine that, a title, land, authority, wealth enough to care for his family for generations. Sancho's eyes widened. An island. He had never thought of such a thing. He did not entirely believe it was possible. After all, where would Don Quixote get an island? But then again, what if it was? What if, just maybe, this strange man was right? What if there were islands out there, waiting to be won? And even if he was wrong, even if there was no island, would it not be something to see the world beyond his village? To go on an adventure, just once, before age and routine claimed the rest of his life? He thought about it that night, lying in bed beside his wife, staring at the dark ceiling. His life was not bad. He had food, shelter, a family who loved him, but it was also entirely predictable. He knew what tomorrow would bring, and the day after that, and the year after that. He would plow and plant and harvest until his back gave out. He would grow old in the same small house. He would die without ever having seen more than 20 miles beyond his birthplace. Was that enough? His wife scolded him when he mentioned it the next morning. She called him a fool, said he was throwing away good sense for nonsense. Their neighbor had vanity and delusions, and Sancho was a fool to indulge them. What about the planting? What about the children? What about the island that did not exist? But Sancho, gentle and stubborn in his own way, had made up his mind. He would go, just for a little while, just to see, and who knew, maybe there was an island after all. And so it was that Don Quixote gained his squire. They prepared to leave together. Don Quixote polished his armor once more, sharpened his lance, spoke encouragingly to Rocinante. Sancho packed provisions, bread, cheese, olives, a skin of wine, a bit of dried meat. He saddled his donkey, a patient grey creature he had owned for years, a beast that seemed resigned to whatever strange fate awaited it. Where Don Quixote rode Rocinante with an air of nobility, his spine straight and his gaze distant, Sancho sat on his donkey with the posture of a man trying to stay comfortable on a long journey. They set out one clear morning, the two of them side by side. The village watched them go, some amused, some concerned, some simply indifferent. Don Quixote's niece stood in the doorway, wringing her hands. Sancho's wife stood with her arms crossed, shaking her head. The children waved, thinking it was all a grand game. The road opened before them, dry and dusty, stretching toward the horizon. The sun climbed higher. The air grew warm. The contrast between knight and squire was immediate and almost comical. Don Quixote sat tall and thin, his armor gleaming dully in the light, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his expression grave with purpose. Sancho slouched, his belly resting comfortably, his eyes on the road ahead, his mind on practical matters. How long the bread would last, whether they had packed enough water, whether his donkey's limp would get worse. As they rode, they talked. And oh, how they talked. It became clear very quickly that they saw the world in entirely different ways. Don Quixote spoke of honor, of glory, of the code of chivalry that governed all knightly behavior. He explained that they must help anyone in distress, fight any injustice, endure any hardship without complaint. A knight's life was one of sacrifice and nobility. Comfort was irrelevant. Danger was to be welcomed. Glory was the only reward that mattered. Sancho listened and then asked practical questions. What if the person in distress didn't want help? What if fighting injustice got them killed? What about meals? Would there be regular meals? And what about sleep? Surely even knights needed sleep. Don Quixote was patient in his way. He explained that these concerns were beneath a true knight. A squire must have faith. The road would provide, destiny would guide them. God watched over the righteous. Everything would work out as it should. Sancho was not convinced, but he was good-natured. He shrugged and accepted it. After all, he had agreed to come, He might as well see where this strange road led. As the day went on, their conversation deepened. Sancho began to ask about the stories Don Quixote loved so much. What were these knights like? What did they do? How did one become a knight in the first place? Don Quixote's face lit up. He told story after story of Amadis of Gaul, who never wavered in his devotion to his lady Oriana, of Palmerin of England, who defeated giants and enchantments, of knights who crossed deserts and seas, who endured imprisonment and exile, who never surrendered their honor no matter the cost. His voice took on a rhythm, almost a music, and Sancho found himself caught up in it despite himself. These were good stories, maybe not true, but good. And Don Quixote, for his part, began to enjoy Sancho's company. The little farmer asked questions that no one else had ever asked him. He listened, even when he did not believe. He was kind, he was steady. He did not mock, even when he could have. He was, Don Quixote realized, exactly the companion he needed. By evening, they made camp beneath a stand of old oak trees. Sancho unpacked the food and they ate together, the bread and cheese tasting better in the open air than it ever had indoors. The sky darkened from blue to purple to black. Stars appeared, bright and numberless, scattered like salt across the heavens. Don Quixote spoke of his lady, Dulcinea del Toboso. He described her beauty, her grace, her virtue. He spoke as though she were a queen, a goddess, the most perfect being ever to walk the earth. Her eyes, he said, were like stars. Her voice was sweeter than any music. Her goodness was a light that would guide him through any darkness. Sancho, chewing his bread, listened and then said cautiously that he thought he might know who Don Quixote was talking about. Wasn't there a farm girl named Aldonza from El Toboso? Sturdy girl, good with animals. Don Quixote stiffened. That name meant nothing to him, he said coldly. He spoke only of Dulcinea, the lady of his heart, a woman beyond compare. Sancho, wisely, let the matter drop. He was beginning to understand that his master lived in two worlds at once, the world as it was, and the world as he believed it to be. And in some strange way, Sancho found this less troubling than he had expected. Who was to say which world was more real? If Don Quixote wanted to see castles and ladies and noble quests, well, there were worse things to believe in. At least his delusions made him kind. At least they gave him purpose. That night, as Don Quixote kept watch, insisting, as knights did, on guarding their camp against unseen dangers, Sancho lay on the ground, wrapped in his cloak, staring up at the stars. He thought about his wife, his children, his little plot of land. He thought about the island he had been promised. And he thought, not for the last time, that he had made a very strange decision. But as he drifted towards sleep, listening to Don Quixote murmur softly about honor and destiny, Sancho realized something else. He was not unhappy. In fact, against all reason, he was content. The ground was hard, yes. The night was cool. Tomorrow would bring who knew what kind of madness. But the stars were beautiful. The bread had been good. And there was something oddly comforting about lying here in the dark, knowing that someone was keeping watch, protecting him from dangers that probably did not exist. The road stretched ahead of them, unknown and full of possibility. And for the first time in his life, Sancho Panza was not entirely sure what tomorrow would bring. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. It was, he supposed, an adventure. They had been traveling for 2 days when they saw them. The morning had begun like the one before, wide sky, dry earth, the two of them moving steadily along the road with no particular destination in mind. Sancho was telling a story about his village, something about a neighbor's pig that had gotten loose during a wedding. It was a rambling, pointless story, the kind villagers told to pass the time, but it made Don Quixote smile beneath his helmet. There was something soothing about Sancho's voice, about the ordinariness of his tales. They reminded him, in some distant way, of a life he had once lived. And then Don Quixote stopped. His hand rose, silencing Sancho mid-sentence. His entire body went rigid. Even Rocinante seemed to sense the change, the horse's ears pricking forward. Sancho followed his gaze and saw them, 30 or 40 windmills, standing in a line across the plain. This was La Mancha, after all. Windmills were common here, their sails turning slowly in the constant wind, grinding grain for the surrounding villages. They were tall structures, their whitewashed walls bright against the sky, their great wooden arms creaking as they turned in steady rhythm. Ordinary, familiar, harmless as sheep, but Don Quixote did not see windmills, he saw giants. Fortune, he breathed, his voice tight with both fear and exhilaration, favors the brave. He turned to Sancho, his eyes blazing with purpose behind the visor. Do you see them, Sancho? 30 or perhaps 40 giants, standing there, their arms raised, threatening the countryside. This is exactly the sort of evil a knight-errant is sworn to destroy. We have been brought to this place for a reason. I will strike them down, every one of them, and the world will be safer for it. Sancho blinked. He looked again at the windmills. They looked, as far as he could tell, exactly like windmills. Master, he said carefully, those aren't giants. They're windmills. We use them to grind grain. Surely you've seen them before. But Don Quixote was already spurring Rocinante forward. Giants, he insisted. Enormous, evil giants. Some of them had arms 40 feet long, perhaps more. He could see them clearly, their great hulking bodies, their massive limbs moving in slow, menacing rhythm. And no matter what enchantments made them appear otherwise, he would not be fooled. A knight saw truth where others saw illusion. Sancho called after him, his voice rising with panic. They're windmills, master, please, they're only windmills. But Don Quixote did not listen. He was already galloping, or trying to gallop. Rocinante managed something between a trot and a stumble. Toward the nearest windmill, his lance leveled, his voice rising in a battle cry that echoed across the empty plain. Do not flee, you cowards and villains, he shouted at the windmills. It is but one knight who challenges you. Come, face me if you dare. The windmill turned slowly in the breeze, its sails moving in their ancient pattern, indifferent to the armored man approaching on a tired horse. Don Quixote struck. His lance hit one of the great wooden sails just as it swept downward with all the weight and momentum of timber and machinery. The impact was immediate and catastrophic. The sail caught the lance and lifted it, and Don Quixote with it, for he refused to let go. For a moment, he was airborne, still clinging desperately to the lance, his armor clattering, his legs kicking in the air like a child's. Then the sail completed its rotation and flung him to the ground. He landed hard. The armor made a terrible noise as it hit the earth, a crash of metal on stone that sent birds scattering from nearby bushes. The lance splintered into pieces. Rocinante, startled by the noise and probably relieved to be rid of his rider, shied away and then stopped a few paces distant, looking entirely done with the whole affair. Sancho, still on his donkey some distance away, urged the beast forward as quickly as it would go, which was not very quick at all. By the time he reached Don Quixote, the knight was groaning, trying to sit up, tangled in his own armor and cloak, and the remnants of his lance. Master, Sancho dismounted and knelt beside him, his hands hovering, unsure where to touch without causing more pain. Are you hurt? Please tell me you're not badly hurt. Can you move? Can you breathe? Don Quixote pushed himself into a sitting position, wincing with every movement. Nothing broken, he said, though he had to stop and take several shallow breaths before he could continue. His ribs ached terribly, and his shoulder felt wrong, displaced somehow, but that was to be expected. Giants were formidable opponents. He had known the risk when he charged. Sancho looked up at the windmill, which continued to turn peacefully, its sails cutting through the air with a soft whistling sound, grinding grain as it had done for years, and would continue to do long after they were gone. It's a windmill, Sancho said again, gently this time, as though speaking to a confused child. Master, it was always a windmill, only a windmill. But Don Quixote shook his head slowly, carefully. No, it had been a giant, he was certain of it. He had seen it clearly, the massive body, the cruel eyes, the arms raised to strike. But at the last moment, just as he was about to achieve victory, an enchanter had transformed it. This was the work of Freston, his enemy, that accursed magician who had stolen his library. Freston was jealous of Don Quixote's glory and sought to thwart him at every turn. The giant had become a windmill just to rob him of his triumph, to make him look foolish before his squire and before the world. Sancho did not argue. He could see there was no point. The belief was too deep, too necessary somehow. Instead, he helped his master to his feet, supporting most of his weight, and brushed the dust from his armor. He retrieved what was left of the lance, just splinters now, useless. and helped Don Quixote back onto Rocinante, who accepted his rider with visible reluctance. Together, they moved away from the Windmills, Sancho glancing back at them nervously, as though they might yet do something unexpected, and Don Quixote muttering about enchanters and the unfairness of magic and how difficult it was to achieve glory when the very world conspired against you. They found a place to rest beneath a tree, an old olive tree with twisted branches that provided a circle of shade. Sancho unpacked food and insisted Don Quixote eat something. Bread, cheese, a bit of wine to dull the pain. Don Quixote ate slowly, mechanically, still shaken, though he tried to hide it behind talk of strategy and future battles. Sancho watched him and felt a complicated knot of emotions tightening in his chest. Pity, certainly. His master was hurt, humiliated, and did not even understand why. The man had charged a windmill and been defeated by it, and still he saw giants. Still he believed. But there was also something else, something almost like admiration. Because Don Quixote, even now, even bruised and defeated and aching, still believed. He still thought he was fighting for something. He still thought he was doing something noble and necessary. Was that madness? Yes, undoubtedly. But was it also brave? Sancho was beginning to think it might be. "Master," Sancho said after a while, when Don Quixote had finished eating and was staring out at the horizon with that distant look he sometimes got, "why do you think everything is enchanted? Why can't things just be what they are?" Don Quixote considered the question seriously, which he always did with Sancho's questions, no matter how simple they seemed. Because, he explained, the world was full of magic. Enchanters and wizards moved through it, unseen by ordinary people, changing things, hiding things, making the extraordinary appear ordinary so that wonder would die and the world would become flat and dull. Most people could not see through the enchantments. They accepted the surface of things and never looked deeper. But a knight could. A knight had to. That was part of the calling, to see truth where others saw only illusion. And what if, Sancho said carefully, choosing his words like a man crossing a frozen river, what if there are no enchanters? What if things are just what they are, windmills and inns and farm girls? Don Quixote looked at him with something like sadness, a depth of sorrow that surprised Sancho. "Then the world," he said quietly, "would be a much smaller place, Sancho, much smaller and much sadder, and I think that would be a great loss, perhaps the greatest loss of all." Sancho had no answer to that. He looked out across the plain, at the windmills still turning in the distance, their sails catching the light, and wondered. Perhaps his master was mad, but perhaps madness was not the worst thing a person could be. Perhaps there were worse things than seeing giants where others saw windmills. Perhaps giving up on wonder, on possibility, on the belief that the world could be better, perhaps that was the real tragedy. They rested for an hour, then continued on their way. Don Quixote's ribs ached with every step Rocinante took, and he had to hold himself carefully to keep the pain manageable. But he did not complain. A knight endured pain without complaint. That was the code. Sancho rode beside him, quieter than usual, thinking. He thought about his wife, who would be furious if she could see him now, following a man who attacked windmills and called them giants. He thought about the island he had been promised, which seemed more and more like a fantasy with each passing day. He thought about going home, about his fields and his children and his simple, predictable life. But he did not turn back. Something kept him there, riding alongside this strange, battered knight. Maybe it was loyalty. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the promise of an island, however unlikely. Or maybe it was just the simple fact that, for all his madness, Don Quixote needed him. And perhaps, in some way he did not fully understand yet, Sancho needed this too. Needed to be part of something larger than his own small life. Needed to matter to someone. Needed, just once, to see where a road led when you did not know the destination. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose and purple, Don Quixote spoke again. "Sancho," he said, his voice tired but still carrying that undercurrent of certainty, "do you know what makes a knight different from other men?" Sancho shook his head, waiting. "A knight," Don Quixote said, "sees the world not as it is, but as it should be. And then he tries with all his strength to make it so. That is the calling, that is the quest." Sancho thought about that. It sounded beautiful in a way. It also sounded like a good way to get killed by a windmill, but he did not say that. Instead, he said, "I think I understand, master." And perhaps just a little he did. They made camp that night under the stars. Sancho prepared supper while Don Quixote sat staring at the horizon, lost in thoughts of giants and enchanters, and the noble work still to be done. His ribs ached and his shoulder throbbed, but his spirit, somehow, remained unbroken. And if Sancho glanced back toward the windmills in the distance, still turning peacefully in the evening breeze, he did not say so. He simply handed Don Quixote a piece of bread and sat down beside him, close enough that his presence might be a comfort. Tomorrow would bring new adventures, new battles, whether against giants or windmills or something in between, but tonight they rested. Knight and squire, dreamer and realist, madman and witness, together on the endless plain under a sky full of stars. And that, Sancho thought, settling into his blanket and listening to the wind move through the grass, was more than he had ever expected from life. The days that followed the windmill became a pattern, a rhythm that Sancho came to recognize. They would wake with the sun, eat a simple breakfast, and set out across the plains of La Mancha. The landscape rarely changed: dry earth, scrub grass, the occasional olive grove or rocky outcropping. The sky stretched wide and pale above them, and the road, such as it was, wound through the emptiness like a thread. And every day, without fail, Don Quixote would find something to interpret, something to transform, something to battle. One afternoon, as the heat pressed down and the air shimmered with it, they came upon a great cloud of dust rising in the distance. Don Quixote stopped immediately, his hand shading his eyes, peering forward with intense concentration. "Sancho," he said, his voice tight with excitement, "do you see it? Two great armies approaching each other for battle." Sancho looked. He saw dust, just dust, rising from the plain. "Master," he said cautiously, "I don't see any armies, just dust." But Don Quixote was already pointing, describing the scene in elaborate detail. There, on the left flank, he saw the army of the great Emperor Alifanfaron with his golden armor gleaming in the sun. And there, on the right, the forces of King Pentapolin of the Naked Arm advancing to meet him. Don Quixote could see the banners, hear the trumpets, see the flash of swords being drawn. Sancho squinted. The dust was getting closer. And then, gradually, shapes began to emerge from it. Sheep, not armies, not soldiers. Just two large flocks of sheep being driven along the road by shepherds, raising dust as they came. "Master," Sancho said, more urgently now, "those are sheep, flocks of sheep. Please look closer." But Don Quixote was not listening. He was already describing the knights in each army, naming them, recounting their histories and their heraldic devices. And then, as the flocks drew nearer, he made his decision. He would enter the battle. He would strike down the enemies of King Pentapolin and prove his valor. Sancho tried to grab Rocinante's reins, tried to stop what was about to happen, but it was too late. Don Quixote spurred his horse forward and charged directly into the nearest flock. The result was chaos. Sheep scattered in every direction, bleating in panic. Don Quixote swung his new lance. He had found a sturdy branch to replace the broken one, striking at the animals he believed were knights. The shepherds, seeing a madman attacking their flock, began shouting and then throwing stones. One stone hit Don Quixote square in the ribs, already bruised from the windmill. Another struck his helmet with a clang that echoed across the plain. He fell from Rocinante, landing once again on the hard ground, and the sheep flowed around him like water. Sancho rushed to his side, shouting apologies to the shepherds, trying to calm the situation. The shepherds, furious and bewildered, eventually collected their scattered flocks and moved on, muttering about madmen and the sorry state of the world. Don Quixote lay on the ground, groaning. His mouth was bleeding. One of the stones had knocked loose several teeth. Sancho helped him sit up, gave him water to rinse his mouth, and tried not to cry at the sight of his master's battered face. "Enchanters," Don Quixote mumbled through swollen lips. "They turned the armies into sheep, to rob me of glory." Sancho said nothing. He simply helped Don Quixote back onto Rocinante, and they continued on, moving more slowly now, the knight swaying slightly in his saddle. That night they came upon a funeral procession, a group of men in dark robes, carrying torches and accompanying a body to burial in a nearby town. The torches flickered in the darkness, and the men's voices rose and fell in prayer. Don Quixote, seeing the torches and the dark-robed figures, immediately assumed they were wicked knights, probably sorcerers, who had kidnapped some noble person. Without hesitation, he charged at them. The mourners scattered, terrified by this armored figure appearing out of the darkness. One man fell and injured his leg. The others fled into the night, leaving the coffin behind on the road. Sancho caught up to find Don Quixote standing over the coffin, triumphant, believing he had rescued someone from great evil. When they opened it and found only a corpse, a man who had died of natural causes, Don Quixote decided that he had arrived too late to save the person, but that his intervention had still been noble. The injured mourner, once he realized he was not going to be murdered, limped away into the darkness, cursing all madmen and their horses. Sancho helped close the coffin and said a prayer for the dead man. He was beginning to feel a deep weariness, not of body but of spirit. How long could they go on like this? How many more disasters could one man create while believing he was doing good? But the next day brought something different. As they traveled through a stretch of countryside dotted with cork trees, they saw smoke rising, not the dust of sheep, but real smoke from a real fire. And as they drew closer, they heard voices, shouting, crying. They came upon a small cottage that was burning. A family stood outside, a man, a woman, two small children, watching their home be consumed by flames. The man was trying to salvage what he could, running in and out of the house despite his wife's pleading. The children were crying. For once, Don Quixote saw the situation exactly as it was. This was not an enchantment. This was not a misunderstanding. This was simply a family in need. He dismounted and approached. He asked what had happened. A cooking fire had spread, the man explained, and now everything they owned was burning. Don Quixote turned to Sancho. Together they helped. They fetched water from a nearby stream, formed a line with the family, threw bucket after bucket onto the flames. They could not save the house, but they saved the small barn beside it. They saved the animals. They saved some tools, some possessions. When it was over and the house was nothing but smoking ruins, the family stood there, exhausted and heartbroken. Don Quixote took off his cloak, one of the few things he owned, and gave it to the woman to wrap around her children. Sancho unpacked most of their remaining food and gave it to the family. The man thanked them, bewildered by this strange knight and his squire, but grateful nonetheless. As Don Quixote and Sancho rode away, leaving the family to begin rebuilding, Sancho felt something shift in his chest. His master was mad, yes. He saw giants in windmills and armies in sheep, but he had also seen a family in need and had helped them without hesitation, without needing to transform the situation into something from his stories. Maybe, Sancho thought, the madness and the goodness were both real. Maybe they existed side by side. They rode in silence for a while, the landscape unchanging around them. The sun moved across the sky. The road stretched on. "Master," Sancho said eventually, "that was a good thing we did back there." Don Quixote nodded. "It is what knights do, Sancho. We help those in need, even when there are no giants or enchanters involved. Especially then," Don Quixote said. "The greatest battles are not always against monsters. Sometimes they are against fire and hunger and despair." Sancho looked at his master with new eyes. Sometimes, just sometimes, the man made sense. That evening, they made camp on a hilltop that overlooked a wide valley. The land rolled away beneath them in shades of gold and brown. The sky deepened from blue to purple to black. Stars emerged, one by one, until the heavens were filled with them. They ate their meager supper. They had given most of their food to the family, and what remained was very little. But neither of them complained. Don Quixote pointed out constellations, telling stories about them, myths and legends, nights among the stars. Sancho listened, watching the sky, and felt something he had not expected to feel on this journey. Peace. Yes, his master was mad. Yes, tomorrow would likely bring more disasters. But tonight, under these stars, with the valley spread below them and the night air cool on his face, Sancho Panza felt that he was exactly where he was meant to be. "Tell me about Dulcinea," Sancho said, settling back against his saddle. "What would she think of our adventures?" Don Quixote's face softened. He spoke of his lady, of her beauty and grace, of how everything he did was in her name. It was a gentle rambling, full of poetry and devotion, and Sancho let it wash over him like music. Eventually, Don Quixote's voice faded into silence. Sancho looked over and saw that his master had fallen asleep, still sitting up, his head nodding forward. Carefully, Sancho moved over and eased him down onto his blanket. Don Quixote stirred but did not wake. Sancho covered him with his cloak and sat back, keeping watch. The stars wheeled overhead. The valley below was dark and silent, and Sancho Panza, simple farmer, squire to a mad knight, felt something like contentment settle over him. Tomorrow they would ride on. There would be more windmills, more sheep, more misunderstandings and disasters. But there would also be this, quiet nights and friendship, and the strange nobility of a man who refused to stop dreaming, no matter how many times the world knocked him down. And that, Sancho thought, was worth something, maybe even worth an island. 3 days later, they encountered the barber. It was midday, and the sun was merciless. The heat pressed down on them like a weight, making the air shimmer and waver. The landscape around them was scrubland and dust, dotted with the occasional cork tree, but offering little shade. Both Don Quixote and Sancho were tired, dusty, and dreaming of shade and water. They had spent the previous night sleeping rough, with no inn nearby, and breakfast had been the last of the stale bread, and some water that tasted faintly of the leather skin it had been carried in. Don Quixote's armor was an oven, trapping the heat against his body. Sweat ran down his back and pooled in uncomfortable places, but he did not complain. Discomfort, as he had told Sancho many times, was part of the nightly calling. Sancho, for his part, rode slumped on his donkey, half asleep, thinking longingly of his wife's cooking and the shade of his own small house. As they crested a small rise, they saw a man on a mule approaching from the opposite direction. He was just a village barber, traveling to a nearby town to ply his trade. He had his tools with him in a saddlebag, razors, scissors, combs. The day was hot, unbearably so, and so he had placed his brass basin, the one he used for shaving customers, on his head to shield himself from the direct sun. It was a practical solution, the kind of thing people did without thinking twice. The basin shone in the light, gleaming like polished metal. Don Quixote froze. His hand went to Sancho's arm, gripping it tightly enough to leave marks. "Sancho," he breathed, his voice tight with wonder and barely contained excitement. "Do you see what I see?" Sancho looked. He saw a barber, a man on a mule, a brass basin being used as a sun hat. He had seen similar things 100 times in his life. "A barber master," Sancho said wearily, "just a barber trying to keep the sun off his head." But Don Quixote shook his head, his eyes wide with wonder. "No, Sancho. That is no ordinary barber, and that is no ordinary basin. That man is a knight, and upon his head he wears the golden helmet of Mambrino." Sancho sighed deeply, a sound that came from the bottom of his soul. Here we go again, he thought. The golden helmet of Mambrino was famous in the tales of chivalry, a magical helmet that made its wearer invincible in battle, that had been worn by the greatest knights of legend. According to the stories, it had been forged by ancient wizards and blessed by saints. Kings had fought wars for it, knights had died seeking it, and Don Quixote, seeing a brass shaving basin gleaming in the sun, believed he had found it. "That helmet," Don Quixote said, his voice trembling with excitement and destiny, "is meant for me. Fortune has placed it in my path. After all my trials, after all my struggles, this is my reward. I will claim it." Before Sancho could protest, before he could say anything at all, Don Quixote was already spurring Rocinante forward, charging toward the bewildered barber with his lance raised and a battle cry on his lips. The barber, riding peacefully along and thinking about nothing more threatening than his next appointment, suddenly heard hoofbeats and shouting. He looked up and saw an armored madman bearing down on him, lance leveled, screaming about helmets and destiny. The barber did the only sensible thing. He let out a yelp of terror, threw the basin aside, and fled, spurring his mule into the fastest pace it could manage. Within moments, he had disappeared around a bend in the road, leaving the basin lying in the dust where it had fallen. Don Quixote dismounted and approached the basin as though it were a holy relic. He picked it up with trembling hands, held it up to the light, turning it this way and that, examining every inch of it with reverent attention. "The golden helmet of Mambrino," he whispered. At long last, This is a sign, Sancho, a sign that our quest is blessed, that we are on the righteous path. Sancho looked at the basin. It was dented from years of use. It was tarnished, with spots of green oxidation on the rim. It had a very obvious, very specific use, shaving. There were still traces of soap residue on the rim and a few stray hairs caught in a dent. "Master," he said as gently as he could manage, trying to find words that would not upset the moment but might introduce some reason, "that's a shaving basin. That man was a barber. He was using it to keep the sun off his head, nothing more." Don Quixote looked at him with pity, the kind of pity one might show to a child who cannot yet read. "Poor Sancho, your eyes are veiled by mundane concerns. You see only surfaces, only the ordinary world. But I see clearly. I see truth beneath enchantments. This is the helmet. The magic that hides its true nature cannot fool me. My heart knows what is real." He placed the basin on his head. It was too large and wobbled slightly when he moved. The soap residue left a faint white mark on his forehead. One edge of the basin came down almost to his eyebrows. He looked, Sancho thought sadly, completely ridiculous. But Don Quixote stood straighter. He squared his shoulders. He touched the basin gently, reverently, and he smiled, a smile of such pure joy that Sancho felt his heart twist. "Now I am truly armed," Don Quixote said. "With the helmet of Mambrino upon my head, I am ready for any challenge. No giant, no enchanter, no army can stand against me now." They continued on their way, Don Quixote wearing the basin with immense pride, adjusting it occasionally when it slipped, treating it like the crown jewel he believed it to be. Sancho rode beside him and wondered, not for the first time, whether to laugh or weep. As the afternoon stretched on, they talked. These conversations had become one of the rhythms of their journey, long, meandering discussions that helped pass the miles and made the sameness of the landscape bearable. Sancho asked about the helmet, playing along in his way. "If that's the helmet of Mambrino, master, does it make you invincible?" "In a sense," Don Quixote replied seriously, touching the basin again. "It protects the wearer from harm, yes, but more importantly, it is a symbol, a reminder that fortune favors the brave, that destiny guides those who pursue noble causes, that faith itself is a kind of armor. And if someone hits you while you're wearing it, then the blow will be deflected," Don Quixote said confidently. "Or if not deflected, then at least softened by the helmet's magic. That is the way of enchanted objects." Sancho decided not to point out that the basin was made of brass and would probably conduct the force of a blow directly to the skull beneath it, possibly making things worse rather than better. Instead, he asked, "Where shall we go now, master? What adventure should we seek next?" Don Quixote considered this thoughtfully. They had been wandering somewhat aimlessly, taking roads as they found them, following the whims of chance. But a knight needed purpose. He needed direction. He needed quests with meaning. "We should seek those in need," Don Quixote said. "The oppressed, the suffering, those who cry out for justice. Wherever there is wrong, we must seek to right it. That is the knightly path, Sancho. That is our calling. And if we don't find anyone like that, then we continue looking," Don Quixote said simply. "A knight's work is never done. There is always another wrong to right, another person to help, another chance to prove that goodness still exists in the world." They rode in comfortable silence for a while. The heat began to ease as the sun moved lower in the sky, though the air remained warm. They passed through a small grove of olive trees, and the shade was a blessing, a relief so profound that both of them sighed as they entered it. They stopped to rest, and Sancho shared out the last of their provisions, some hard cheese and a few olives they had collected from the ground beneath these very trees days earlier. As they sat beneath the twisted branches, their backs against the ancient trunks, Don Quixote spoke of Dulcinea again. It had become a habit, this talk of his lady. He would describe her beauty, her virtue, her perfection. And Sancho had learned to listen without commenting, to let the words flow like water, to treat these moments as sacred in their own way. Today, though, Don Quixote's tone was different, softer, more wistful, more human somehow. "I wonder," he said quietly, looking up through the olive branches at the sky beyond, "if she knows of my quest. If she has any idea that a knight travels in her name, that every deed I do is offered to her honor, every battle fought for her glory." "Perhaps she does, master," Sancho said gently. Perhaps she feels it somehow in her heart. Don Quixote smiled, a sad and gentle smile that made him look, for a moment, like the aging gentleman he truly was rather than the knight he believed himself to be. That would be enough. I do not need her to love me in return. I do not even need her to know my name. I only need to love her, to serve her, to dedicate my deeds to her honor. That is the privilege of a knight, to love without expectation, to serve without reward. Sancho looked at his master, this thin, battered man wearing a brass basin and calling it a golden helmet, who loved a woman who did not know he existed, who fought windmills and called them giants, who saw magic where there was only brass and soap, and felt his heart ache with something he could not quite name. Pity, yes, but also affection, and a strange kind of respect, because Don Quixote, for all his madness, loved so completely. He committed so fully to his vision of what the world should be. He never wavered, never compromised, never gave up his dream, no matter how many times reality struck him down. Was it foolish? Yes. Was it also beautiful? Sancho was beginning to think so. As evening approached, they made camp beneath the olive trees. Don Quixote carefully removed the helmet, the basin, and polished it with his cloak, rubbing gently at the tarnished spots, treating it like the sacred object he believed it to be. Then he set it beside his bedroll, positioning it carefully so that it would be the first thing he saw when he woke, and lay down to sleep. Sancho kept watch for a while, as he often did. The sky darkened. The stars came out, one by one, then in clusters, then in great sweeping rivers of light. The olive trees rustled softly in the night breeze, their leaves whispering secrets to the darkness. He thought about the basin, about windmills and sheep, about a family beside their burning home, and the cloak Don Quixote had given without hesitation, about all the strange, impossible, contradictory things he had witnessed since joining this quest. And he thought about what Don Quixote had said days ago: a knight sees the world not as it is, but as it should be, and then he tries to make it so. What would the world look like if everyone did that? If everyone refused to accept cruelty and injustice and ordinary sadness as inevitable? If everyone insisted on seeing possibility where others saw only limitation? If everyone chose to believe in something better, even when all evidence suggested otherwise? Maybe it would look like madness at first. Maybe people would laugh and throw stones and run away in fear. But maybe, just maybe, something beautiful could come of it too. Maybe belief itself could change things. Maybe imagination was its own kind of truth. Sancho looked at the brass basin, gleaming faintly in the starlight. To Don Quixote, it was the golden helmet of Mambrino. It was magic. It was power. It was proof that his quest mattered, that his faith would be rewarded. And who was Sancho to say it wasn't? If his master needed to believe that a barber's basin could be a sacred helmet, if that belief gave him courage and purpose and joy, then perhaps it was sacred. Perhaps belief itself was the magic. Perhaps the helmet was golden because Don Quixote's faith made it so. Sancho pulled his cloak tighter around his shoulders and settled into sleep. Tomorrow they would wake and ride on. There would be more adventures, more misunderstandings, more moments when Sancho would have to choose between what he knew to be true and what his master needed to believe. But tonight, under the olive trees, with the brass basin gleaming like gold in the starlight, Sancho Panza chose to believe with him. Just a little, just enough to understand why a man might trade the ordinary world for a dream. 2 days after claiming the helmet, Don Quixote and Sancho came upon a sight that stirred something deep in the knight's sense of justice. They were traveling along the main road when they heard the sound of chains, metal against metal, a rhythmic clanking that carried across the dry landscape. Voices too, and the crack of a whip that made Sancho flinch. As they came around a bend, they saw them. A group of men, perhaps 12 in all, chained together at the neck and wrists, shuffling forward in a miserable line. They were being led by guards on horseback, men carrying muskets and wearing expressions of bored authority. These men in chains were galley slaves, condemned criminals being taken to the coast where they would spend years rowing the king's ships. It was brutal work, often a death sentence served slowly under the whip and the Mediterranean sun. Many men went to the galleys and never returned. Don Quixote reigned in Rocinante and watched the procession approach. His face, what Sancho could see of it beneath the brass basin helmet, was grave. His hand moved unconsciously to the hilt of his sword. Sancho felt a familiar dread settling in his stomach. He knew that expression. Something was about to happen. "Who are these men?" Don Quixote called out to the guards. One of the guards, a grizzled man with a scar across his cheek and the look of someone who had done this journey many times before, answered without much interest. "Galley slaves, criminals, condemned by the king's justice. We're taking them to the coast." Don Quixote dismounted slowly, carefully, like a man preparing for something important. Sancho, sensing trouble, stayed on his donkey but moved closer, ready to intervene if necessary, though what he could do against armed guards, he had no idea. "I would speak with them," Don Quixote said. "If these men go to their punishment, I wish to hear their stories. I wish to understand what crimes have earned them such a fate." The guards shrugged. What harm could it do? They were in no particular hurry. The day was long and hot, and a rest was welcome. The prisoners weren't going anywhere. Don Quixote walked along the line of men, speaking to each one, asking gently why they had been condemned. Sancho followed, listening, his heart growing heavier with each tale. The stories varied, but a pattern emerged. One man, gaunt and hollow-eyed, had stolen 2 shirts from a clothesline because his children were cold, 10 years in the galleys. Another had fallen in love with the wrong woman and helped her escape an arranged marriage to a cruel man, 6 years. A third had spoken publicly against a local magistrate who was known to be corrupt, 12 years. One young man, barely more than a boy with soft hands and frightened eyes, had been caught poaching a rabbit from noble land because his mother was starving, 8 years. With each story, Don Quixote's expression grew darker. These were not evil men. They were not the villains from his tales of chivalry, the wicked sorcerers and cruel giants. They were simply poor, desperate, or unlucky, and now they would be destroyed for it, their lives reduced to rowing until their hands bled and their backs broke. When he had heard all their stories, Don Quixote stood silent for a long moment. Then he turned to the guards. "These men," he said, "are being punished beyond all reason. Their crimes are small. Most are not crimes of evil, but of necessity or love or conscience. Their suffering will be great, far exceeding what justice requires. I cannot, in good conscience, allow this to continue." The guards looked at each other. One of them, a younger man, laughed uncertainly. "What do you mean, allow? These men are condemned by the king's justice. You have no say in the matter." Don Quixote drew himself up to his full height. The brass basin glinted in the sun. His hand rested on his sword. "I am a knight-errant," he said, and his voice carried the absolute conviction that Sancho had come to recognize. "My duty is to protect the oppressed and free those unjustly held. These men suffer under laws that value property over people, that punish poverty as though it were wickedness. They must go free." The scarred guard stopped finding this amusing. His hand moved to his musket. "You're mad, they're criminals. They stay chained and that's the end of it." "Then I must free them by force," Don Quixote said, and before anyone could react, he had drawn his sword. Sancho tried to intervene, his voice rising to a shout. "Master, please. These men are guarded by the king's law. You can't just. There will be consequences. We'll be hunted." But Don Quixote was already moving. He struck at the first guard, not to kill but to disarm, his blade knocking the musket from unprepared hands. The other guards, taken by surprise by this thin madman's sudden fury, scrambled for their weapons. The slaves, seeing a chance, began to shout and struggle against their chains. What followed was chaos. Don Quixote fought with surprising skill for an aging man. Years of reading about combat had taught him more than Sancho would have expected. His sword moved quickly, disarming one guard, then forcing another back. Sancho, despite his better judgment, despite every instinct telling him to flee, found himself in the fray. He grabbed a rock from the roadside and swung it at a guard who was aiming a musket at Don Quixote's back. The guards, outnumbered now, and not expecting this level of resistance, not being paid enough to die for prisoners, began to fall back. And then the slaves themselves joined in. One of them, a large man with massive shoulders who had been a blacksmith before his arrest, managed to break his chains through sheer strength and fury. He grabbed a fallen guard's weapon and began to free the others, striking at their shackles until the metal broke. Within minutes, all 12 men were loose, and the guards were fleeing down the road on their horses. not willing to die for prisoners they did not particularly care about. Don Quixote stood in the middle of the road, breathing hard, his sword still raised. He looked at the freed men, their broken chains lying in the dust at their feet, and smiled. "You are free," he said. "Go in peace and live well. Remember that when injustice is defeated, it is always through the actions of those who refuse to accept it." The freed slaves looked at each other. Then they looked at Don Quixote, and instead of gratitude, their expressions showed calculation. These were men who had learned to survive, and survival meant taking opportunities when they appeared. One of them, the former blacksmith, stepped forward. "We thank you, Sir Knight, truly, but we have a problem. The guards saw our faces. They know who we are. When we don't arrive at the galleys on schedule, they'll come looking for us." "Then go far from here," Don Quixote said reasonably. "Cross into the next kingdom if you must. Start new lives where you won't be recognized." "We will," the man said, "but first we'll need money, supplies, weapons to protect ourselves on the journey." Don Quixote frowned. "I have little money to give you." "Then we'll take what you have," the man said, and his tone was no longer grateful. It was hard, practical. Several of the other freed men moved to surround Don Quixote and Sancho. "You understand. Nothing personal, but we need to survive." Sancho's heart sank into his boots. This was it. This was how they would die, robbed and beaten, maybe killed, by the very men they had just freed. There was a horrible irony in it. But then one of the younger slaves, the boy who had poached the rabbit, stepped forward. "No," he said quietly but firmly. "This man freed us. He risked everything for us. We don't repay that with violence. We don't become the evil men the law says we are." The blacksmith hesitated. A few of the other men muttered, some in agreement with the boy, some clearly still considering robbery. In the end, they took some of Sancho's provisions, most of the remaining bread and cheese, and one of the guards' abandoned horses. But they did not harm Don Quixote or Sancho. The blacksmith, before leaving, looked at Don Quixote with something that might have been respect or might have been pity. "You're a fool," he said bluntly, "but you're a good fool. I hope you survive long enough to learn the difference between justice and stupidity. They're not always the same thing." Then they were gone, scattering in different directions, disappearing into the landscape like water into sand, each man choosing his own path to whatever freedom might mean. Don Quixote and Sancho stood alone on the empty road. Sancho turned to his master, his voice shaking with anger and fear and disbelief. "Do you realize what you've done? You've freed condemned criminals. You've attacked the king's guards. When they report this, and they will report this, we'll be outlaws ourselves, we'll be hunted." But Don Quixote's face was serene, almost peaceful. "I did what was right, Sancho. Those men were suffering beyond what their small crimes merited. A knight must follow his conscience, not the letter of corrupt or unjust laws. The law said they must suffer. My heart said they must be freed. I chose my heart, but the consequences are mine to bear," Don Quixote said gently. He placed a hand on Sancho's shoulder. "I do not ask you to suffer for my choices. If you wish to leave, to go home to your village and your family, I will understand. You have been a loyal companion, a truer friend than I deserved. But this path becomes more dangerous now. I would not blame you for walking away." Sancho looked at him, this man who had just risked everything for strangers. This man who wore a brass basin as a helmet and saw injustice where others saw necessary order. This man who was almost certainly going to get himself killed, probably soon, probably in some ridiculous way. "I'm not leaving," Sancho heard himself say, surprising himself even as the words came out. "Someone needs to keep you alive, master, and it seems I'm the only one foolish enough to try." Don Quixote smiled, a smile of such warmth and gratitude that Sancho had to look away before he did something embarrassing like cry. They made camp that night far from the road, hidden in an outcropping of rocks where they could see anyone approaching. They did not light a fire, in case the guards returned with reinforcements. They ate the little food they had left, barely enough for one meal, and spoke in whispers. "Do you think they'll be all right?" Sancho asked after a long silence, meaning the freed men. "The slaves. Some will," Don Quixote said thoughtfully. "Some will find new lives, new names, new chances. Some will be caught again within days. But for a moment they were free. They stood without chains. They chose their own paths, and that moment was worth preserving." Sancho thought about that. About 12 men in chains becoming 12 men choosing their own destinies, however briefly. About how short that moment of freedom might be, and whether it was worth all this trouble, all this danger. He thought about the young boy, the one who had defended them when the others wanted to rob them. Maybe that boy would make it. Maybe he would find somewhere safe, somewhere he could live without fear. Maybe one moment of freedom could change a whole life. Or maybe they would all be caught by morning and punished even more harshly for escaping. Sancho didn't know, couldn't know. But looking at his master, who slept peacefully on the hard ground despite having made himself an outlaw, despite the hunger and the danger, Sancho understood something important. Don Quixote didn't measure success by outcomes. He measured it by intention, by trying, by refusing to walk past suffering just because it was legal or sanctioned or none of his business. Was that wise? Probably not. Was it noble? Sancho was beginning to think it might be. Might be the very definition of noble. He pulled his cloak tighter and kept watch through the long hours of the night, listening for the sound of horses or footsteps or the clink of armor. But none came. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. The night passed slowly, peacefully. And in the morning, they woke and continued their journey, outlaws now, criminals in the eyes of the law they had defied. But in Don Quixote's eyes, they were simply knights, doing what knights did, standing between the powerful and the powerless, choosing compassion over law when the two were in conflict. And Sancho, despite everything, despite his fear and his doubts and his absolute certainty that this would all end badly, found that he was proud to ride beside him. After the incident with the galley slaves, Don Quixote and Sancho knew they needed to disappear for a while. The guards would return with reinforcements, questions would be asked, and a man in armor wearing a brass basin was not difficult to track. And so they turned away from the main roads and headed into the mountains. The Sierra Morna rose before them, wild, ancient mountains covered in oak and pine, cut through with narrow valleys and rocky passes. It was beautiful in a harsh way, the kind of beauty that made you aware of your own smallness. The peaks were crowned with stone that looked like it had been there since the beginning of the world. Few people lived here. Shepherds sometimes, hermits occasionally, outlaws frequently. It was a good place to hide. It was also a good place to get lost and never be found. They climbed for 2 days, following goat paths and streams, moving deeper into the wilderness. Rocinante struggled on the steep terrain, his old bones not meant for such challenges. Sancho's donkey was more sure-footed, but still stumbled often on loose stones. They were all tired, all hungry. Their provisions were nearly gone, all feeling the weight of their exile. But Don Quixote's spirits, paradoxically, seemed to rise. The mountains reminded him of stories. Knights often retreated to wild places to do penance, to prove their devotion to their ladies, to test themselves against nature itself. Amadis had done it, so had Palmerin. Now it was his turn. On the 3rd day, as they entered a narrow valley with a stream running through it, surrounded by trees and stone, Don Quixote announced his intention. "Sancho," he said, his voice thoughtful, "I have decided to perform a penance here." Sancho, who had been thinking about food and was only half listening, looked up from examining their meager supplies. "A what?" "A penance. An act of devotion to my lady, Dulcinea del Toboso." The great knight Amadis, when separated from his love Oriana, retreated to the wilderness and performed acts of self-denial and suffering to prove his devotion. "I will do the same, it is the knightly way." Sancho stared at him. "Master, we're already in the wilderness, we're already suffering, we have almost no food, we're being hunted by the king's men. Isn't that penance enough?" But Don Quixote shook his head. "That is merely circumstance, Sancho. Misfortune is not the same as penance. True penance is chosen, deliberate. It is a gift freely given. I will stay here in these mountains. I will fast, I will weep for my absent lady. I will perform acts that demonstrate the depth of my love." "What kind of acts?" Sancho asked warily, fearing the answer. "Dramatic ones," Don Quixote said, warming to his theme. "I will tear my clothing to show how love has torn my heart. I will write poetry on the bark of trees so that travelers might read of my devotion. I will leap from rock to demonstrate love's agility. I will do handstands and somersaults to show that love has driven me to beautiful madness." Sancho could not help himself. He laughed. It started as a nervous chuckle and grew until he was bent over, tears streaming from his eyes. The image of his gaunt, aging master, who sometimes struggled to mount his horse, doing somersaults in the mountains, was too much. Don Quixote waited patiently for the laughter to subside, his expression dignified and slightly wounded. When Sancho finally controlled himself, wiping his eyes and trying to breathe, Don Quixote said gently, "I know it seems absurd to you, but this is what knights do. This is how love is honored in the stories. This is what it means to dedicate oneself completely." Sancho sobered, feeling guilty for laughing. "And how long will this penance last, master? Until you return with word from my lady." "Return? Return from where?" "From El Toboso," Don Quixote said, as though it were obvious. "You will go there, find the lady Dulcinea, present yourself to her as my squire, and tell her of my devotion. You will describe my penance, my suffering here in the wilderness, my unwavering love, and you will return to me with her response, whatever it may be." Sancho's mind raced. El Toboso, where Aldonza Lorenzo lived. The farm girl with rough hands and no patience for nonsense. The woman who had no idea she was anyone's lady, let alone Don Quixote's Dulcinea. The woman who, if he actually approached her with this message, would probably throw something at his head. This was going to be complicated, but he also saw an opportunity. If he left the mountains, he could get food. He could rest in a real bed at an inn instead of on rocks and dirt. He could gather information about whether they were being actively hunted. He could let his bruises heal and his blisters stop hurting. And he could give his master time to rest and heal here in the mountains, even if Don Quixote thought he was performing penance. "All right," Sancho said carefully. "I'll go, but you must promise me you'll eat something while I'm gone, at least catch some fish from the stream, and no leaping from rocks. You'll break your neck, and then where will I be?" Don Quixote smiled. "I promise to be as careful as penance allows. Now go, faithful Sancho, and return to me with news of my beloved." Sancho left the next morning, taking the donkey and promising to return within a fortnight. Don Quixote stood at the edge of the valley and watched him go until he disappeared behind a ridge, becoming a small dot and then nothing at all. Then Don Quixote turned to face his solitude. The valley was beautiful in a way that made his chest ache. The stream sang over stones, a constant music. Birds called from the trees, sounds he had never taken time to notice in his old life. The sky was impossibly blue, so deep and pure it seemed like you could fall into it. Don Quixote found a cave, really just an overhang of rock that provided some shelter, and made it his hermitage. He did tear his clothing, though not as dramatically as he had planned. The cloth was already worn thin from weeks of travel, and he needed some protection from the cold mountain nights. So he tore just his shirt, leaving his other garments intact. He did write poetry, scratching verses into tree bark with a sharp stone. It was hard work, and his hands soon blistered, but the verses came easily. They were about Dulcinea, about love and longing and the sweet pain of devotion, about how the mountains held his sorrows and the sky heard his prayers. But mostly, he simply existed in the quiet. For the first time since beginning his quest, Don Quixote had no one to convince, no one to impress. Sancho was gone. There were no villagers to address, no guards to challenge, no audience for his knighthood. And in that solitude, something shifted. He thought about Dulcinea, really thought about her in a way he had not allowed himself before. Who was she? Not Aldonza Lorenzo. He barely knew that woman, had spoken to her twice at most, and what he knew suggested someone very different from his lady. No, Dulcinea was something else. She was an ideal, a dream, a reason to be better than he was, to strive for something beyond the mundane. But did she need to be real for that to work? Did it matter if she existed outside his imagination? He thought about the galley slaves. He had freed them, and it had felt right in the moment, an act of pure justice. But what had he actually accomplished? Half of them would probably be caught again within weeks. Some might commit new crimes, hurt new people. His act of justice had complicated consequences he had not considered, ripples spreading out in ways he could not control. He thought about the windmills, about sheep he had seen as armies, about a brass basin he wore as a golden helmet. And sitting there in the mountains, with no one watching, with only the stream and the birds as witnesses, Don Quixote allowed himself a moment of doubt. What if Sancho was right? What if they were just windmills? What if he was just a foolish old man who had lost his mind in books, who had abandoned his family and his responsibilities to chase fantasies that never existed? The doubt scared him more than any giant or army. It felt like standing at the edge of a great cliff, looking down into emptiness. If he was not a knight, if this was all delusion, then what was he? Just an aging gentleman making a spectacle of himself. Just someone who should go home quietly and accept that life was ordinary and small, and that dreams were for the young and the blessed. He sat with that fear for a day and a night, letting it move through him like cold water. But then the sun rose again, golden on the mountains, light spilling into the valley like honey, and Don Quixote made a choice. Even if it was all delusion, even if the windmills were just windmills, and the basin was just a basin and Dulcinea was just a farm girl who didn't know his name, he would rather live in a world of magic and meaning than a world of pure fact. He would rather be a fool who believed in something than a wise man who believed in nothing. Because what was the alternative? To accept that there was no magic, no wonder, no possibility of transformation. To accept that the world was exactly what it appeared to be and nothing more, that seemed to him a kind of death. Dulcinea might not be real, but his love for the ideal she represented, that was real. That was his. That changed who he was and how he moved through the world. And that was enough. When Sancho returned 12 days later, well fed from proper meals at an inn and bubbling with news from the wider world he had visited, he found Don Quixote thinner but oddly at peace. The knight had not done many dramatic acts of penance. His body was too old and sore for acrobatics, and he had quickly realized that flinging himself about would only result in injury. But he had done something perhaps more difficult. He had looked at his own doubts, faced them honestly, and chosen his dream anyway. "Did you see her?" Don Quixote asked eagerly, scrambling to his feet when Sancho appeared at the valley's entrance. "Did you speak with my lady? What did she say?" Sancho, who had gone nowhere near El Toboso, who had instead spent the time in a comfortable inn recovering from their ordeal and listening to gossip about whether anyone was actually looking for them. They weren't, it seemed. The guards had been too embarrassed to report being bested by one madman, launched into an elaborate lie he had been constructing for days. Yes, he said, he had found Dulcinea. Yes, she was as beautiful as Don Quixote had described, more so even. She had been winnowing wheat when he arrived, he said, making her sound suitably pastoral and noble in her labor. He described her golden hair shining in the sun, her grace as she worked, her kind reception of his message. Don Quixote listened, enraptured. None of it matched what Aldonza Lorenzo actually looked like, but he did not notice or did not care. This was his Dulcinea, the one from his imagination, and Sancho's description fit her perfectly. And her response, Don Quixote asked breathlessly, "What did she say to my devotion? What message does she send me?" Sancho, warming to his fiction now, said that Dulcinea was deeply moved by the tale of penance. She sent her warmest regards and encouraged Don Quixote to continue his noble quest. She would await news of his great deeds and hold him always in her thoughts. Don Quixote's face shone with joy so pure that Sancho felt his throat tighten. "Then we must continue. Our quest is blessed. My lady knows of me, thinks of me. Come, Sancho, let us leave these mountains and return to the world. There is work to be done, wrongs to be righted, honor to be won." As they descended from the Sierra Morna, Sancho riding his donkey and Don Quixote walking beside Rocinante, who was limping slightly, Sancho felt a pang of guilt about his lie. It had been a complete fabrication from start to finish. He had never gone to El Toboso, never sought out Aldonza Lorenzo, never delivered any message. But looking at his master's renewed energy, his rekindled purpose, the way his steps had regained their confidence, Sancho told himself it had been the right thing to do, perhaps even the kind thing. Sometimes, he thought, people needed their dreams more than they needed truth. Sometimes kindness meant helping someone believe, and if that made him complicit in madness, well, Sancho had made his peace with that days ago. Descending from the Sierra Morna, Don Quixote and Sancho found the world had not changed much in their absence. The roads were still dusty, the The sky was still wide. The plains of Spain stretched before them, indifferent to their adventures and their absence. But something had changed between them. Their bond had deepened in ways neither could fully articulate. Sancho had lied to protect his master's dreams, and Don Quixote had chosen to continue believing despite facing his own doubts. They were complicit in each other's delusions now, bound together by something more complicated than simple companionship. They were friends. As they traveled, they encountered other wayfarers on the road, as travelers inevitably do. Some days they saw no one for miles, just the empty landscape and the long sky. Other days, the road became a meeting place for all sorts of people, merchants heading to market with carts full of goods, pilgrims walking to shrines with staffs and prayers, families moving from one village to another with all their possessions on their backs, soldiers returning from campaigns with stories and scars. One afternoon, as the sun hung low and golden, they came upon a small group resting beneath some olive trees. It was a priest, a barber, not the same one whose basin Don Quixote had taken, thankfully, and two women, one young and beautiful, one older and watchful. They had stopped to rest their mules and share a simple meal. Don Quixote and Sancho were invited to join them, as was the custom of the road. Food was shared, bread and cheese and dried fruit. Wine was passed from one skin to another. Introductions were made with the careful politeness of strangers who might become friends. The priest, whose name was Father Pedro, was a kind man with grey hair and laugh lines around his eyes that suggested a lifetime of seeing humor in hard places. The barber was his cousin, traveling with him for company and protection. The two women were nobility, it turned out, a young woman named Dorotea and her attendant. Dorotea had an interesting story. She had fled an unwanted marriage to a cruel man and was seeking refuge with distant relatives who might protect her. As they talked and ate and watched the sun descend, Don Quixote told his story, or the version of it he believed. He spoke of his quest, his battles against giants and evil knights, his liberation of the unjustly imprisoned, his devotion to the peerless Dulcinea del Toboso. He spoke with such sincerity, such absolute conviction, that the others did not know quite how to respond. Father Pedro and the barber exchanged glances. They could see plainly that Don Quixote was mad. His armor was battered, his golden helmet was obviously a brass basin, his horse was a walking skeleton. But he was also harmless, clearly gentle-hearted, and there was something deeply touching about his earnestness. Dorotea, however, saw an opportunity. She was a clever woman, educated and quick-thinking, and she had her own needs. She needed protection on the road. A young woman traveling, even with an attendant, was vulnerable. She needed companions who might deter bandits or worse. And she needed to convince Don Quixote and Sancho to help her without revealing the full truth of her situation. So she played along with Don Quixote's delusion. In fact, she enhanced it with her own considerable theatrical skill. "Sir Knight," she said, rising and then dropping to her knees before Don Quixote with perfect dramatic grace, "I have been seeking a knight-errant such as yourself. I am in desperate need of a champion." Don Quixote leaped to his feet. "My lady, please rise. A lady should not kneel before anyone. Tell me your trouble, and I will remedy it." Dorotea rose slowly, her eyes downcast in a perfect imitation of distress. "I am a princess, the Princess Micomicona, and my kingdom has been stolen by an evil giant named Pandafilando of the gloomy aspect. I have traveled far, searching for a champion brave enough to defeat him and restore my throne. Everyone I have asked has turned me away, saying the giant is too fearsome, too powerful. But perhaps you—" Don Quixote's eyes widened. "A princess, a real princess in distress, seeking his help." This was exactly, precisely the kind of quest the stories described. Sancho watched this performance with growing admiration. The woman was good, very good. She had sized up his master perfectly and was playing to every aspect of his delusion. Don Quixote immediately pledged his services, his voice ringing with conviction. He would defeat the giant Pandafilando, no matter how fearsome. He would restore her kingdom, no matter how distant. He would accept no reward beyond her blessing and the knowledge that he had done right. This was his calling, his purpose. He stood and declared that they would leave immediately for her distant realm that very night if she wished. Father Pedro, understanding what Dorotea was doing and approving of the compassionate deception, played his part too. He agreed to accompany the princess and her champion as spiritual advisor to the expedition. The barber, catching on quickly, declared himself the expedition's chronicler, ready to record Don Quixote's brave deeds. Sancho, seeing that this arrangement would at least give them direction, companions, and shared resources, went along with it gladly. And so their little company formed. By day, they traveled together along the dusty roads of Spain, with Dorotea maintaining her role as a dispossessed princess and Don Quixote as her devoted champion. At night, they would make camp under the stars, and the stories would flow like wine. Don Quixote told tales of chivalry, of Amadis and Palmerin and Lancelot, and the Knights of the Round Table. His voice would take on a rhythmic quality as he recounted their deeds, their loves, their sacrifices. Father Pedro told stories from scripture, gentle parables about mercy and redemption, and the radical power of compassion. The barber told jokes and gossip from the towns they passed through, making everyone laugh with his imitations and observations. Dorotea told stories of her invented kingdom, creating elaborate details with impressive consistency. The castle's 7 towers, the emerald and gold colors of her family's banners, the names of her loyal subjects, the flowers that grew in the palace gardens. Sancho listened to all of it and marveled. This was what his life had become, a traveling company of liars and dreamers, each maintaining their fictions for different reasons. Dorotea lied to ensure her safe passage to her relatives. Father Pedro and the barber lied out of kindness, to keep Don Quixote calm and purposeful and moving in a helpful direction. Don Quixote didn't lie exactly. He simply refused to see truth when it contradicted his beliefs, when it threatened to strip away the magic he needed. And Sancho lied because he had come to love these lies, or at least to love the people who told them. One evening, as they sat around their fire while stars multiplied overhead, Father Pedro asked Don Quixote a question that had been on his mind for days. "Tell me, Sir Knight, what drives you to this life? What makes a man leave his home, leave comfort and safety to take up this quest?" Don Quixote was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames as they danced and shifted. "The world," he said finally, his voice soft but clear, "is full of injustice, full of suffering that people accept as normal, as inevitable, full of small cruelties and large indifferences. Most people see this and shrug. They say that's just how things are, that's just life, nothing to be done. But knights see it differently. We say, that's how things are, yes, but not how they should be, not how they must be. And then we try to close that gap, however we can, with whatever strength we have." Father Pedro nodded slowly. "That's a noble sentiment, truly. But what about the windmills, the flocks of sheep you charged? What about the times when you fight things that aren't evil, that aren't even real?" Don Quixote smiled, a sad smile that made him look simultaneously very old and very young, weathered and innocent. "Perhaps I am sometimes mistaken in my targets. Perhaps enchanters do hide truth from me, or perhaps my eyes are simply failing with age. But I would rather swing my sword at a windmill in the honest belief that I'm fighting injustice than walk past real injustice because I couldn't be bothered to intervene, because it wasn't my concern, because someone told me it was foolish to care. An error of excess seems preferable to an error of indifference." Sancho, listening from his place at the edge of the fire, felt something catch in his throat. His master was mad. There was absolutely no question about that. But there was wisdom in the madness, a kind of moral clarity that sane, practical people often lacked. Dorotea spoke up, her voice gentle. "And your lady, this Dulcinea del Toboso, what role does she play in your quest?" Don Quixote's entire face softened, years falling away. "She is my inspiration, my North Star. When I am tired or discouraged, when the road seems too long and the battles too difficult, I think of her and I find strength. When I am tempted to give up or to accept the world's cruelty as unchangeable, I think of her purity, her virtue, her perfection, and I am renewed. She is the ideal toward which I strive, even knowing I will never reach it." "And if you were to meet her?" Dorotea asked gently, carefully. "Truly meet her, speak with her." Don Quixote thought about that for a long moment. "I'm not sure I would want to," he admitted. "The lady in my imagination is perfect, perfect in every way. The real woman, whoever she might be, could only disappoint compared to that perfection. She would be human, flawed, ordinary in the ways all of us are ordinary. Better, perhaps, to serve the ideal than to be disillusioned by the real. Better to love something perfect from a distance than something imperfect up close. Sancho shifted uncomfortably, thinking of Aldonza Lorenz with her rough hands and practical manner, her complete lack of interest in poetry or knights. His master was probably right about that. They traveled together for nearly 2 weeks, this odd little company. They had small adventures along the way, misunderstandings at inns where Don Quixote insisted on knight-errant privileges, encounters with other travelers who didn't know whether to laugh or call for authorities, moments of comedy and confusion that everyone but Don Quixote seemed to be in on the joke. But mostly they just moved through the landscape, talking and resting and sharing meals, and becoming, in their way, something like a family. And Sancho, watching Don Quixote interact with these people who humored his delusions so gently, began to understand something important. Everyone needed enchantments of some kind. Father Pedro needed to believe in divine mercy even when the world seemed merciless and random. Dorothea needed to believe she could escape her past and build a new future despite all the forces arrayed against her. The barber needed to believe his jokes mattered, that laughter in a hard world had value and purpose. And Don Quixote needed to believe in knights and ladies and noble quests. Were any of these beliefs more real than the others? Sancho wasn't sure anymore. They were all acts of faith. They were all ways of bearing an unbearable world, of finding meaning in the chaos. The difference was that Don Quixote's faith was visible, undeniable, impossible to ignore. He wore it like armor. He proclaimed it like a herald announcing a king. And in doing so, he gave others permission to believe in their own impossible things. When they finally parted ways, Dorothea and her attendant heading east toward her relative's estate, Father Pedro and his cousin turning south toward their home parish, there were genuine tears. They had shared something rare, a pocket of time where everyone agreed to believe in something larger than the dusty road and the ordinary day. "Thank you, Sir Knight," Dorothea said, breaking character for just a moment, meeting his eyes with real warmth. "For everything, for your company, your protection, your kindness." Don Quixote bowed deeply. "But I have not yet defeated the giant Pandafilando and restored your kingdom. I have failed in my sworn duty to you." "No," she said gently, taking his weathered hand in both of hers. "You've succeeded in ways you don't even realize, truly." And then they were gone, disappearing down different roads, and it was just Don Quixote and Sancho again, on their familiar path, with Rocinante and the donkey heading toward whatever adventure the next bend might bring. "She was a good princess," Don Quixote said wistfully, watching the dust settle where their companions had been. "The best," Sancho agreed, not bothering to mention that she wasn't really a princess at all. Some truths he had learned were less important than the belief they inspired. Some lies were kinder than any truth could be. Some days after parting with their traveling companions, hunger and exhaustion drove Don Quixote and Sancho to seek shelter at an inn. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of copper and rose, and they had eaten nothing since a meager breakfast of hard bread and water. Their supplies were exhausted, their money nearly gone, and they were both bone-tired in a way that made thinking difficult. Don Quixote, true to form, did not see an inn. He saw a castle, though not as grand as some he had imagined. This one had weathered stone walls and a sagging tile roof, and the courtyard was muddy and filled with chickens pecking at scattered grain, but it was still, in his eyes, a castle. Perhaps a modest castle, one that had seen better days and fewer funds, but a castle nonetheless where noble travelers could find rest. "We shall seek hospitality here, Sancho," he announced with the formality he always employed when approaching what he believed to be noble residences, as is the custom among knights of the road. Sancho, who saw the inn exactly for what it was and was profoundly grateful for it, merely shrugged and dismounted with a groan. His bones ached, his back was stiff, his clothes were crusted with dust and sweat. He would have slept in a barn at this point and been grateful for clean straw. The innkeeper appeared, a round-faced woman of perhaps 40 years with sharp eyes, and a manner that suggested she had seen every possible variety of traveler and been impressed by precisely none of them. But when she saw Don Quixote in his battered armor with his brass basin helmet tucked under one arm, something in her expression softened. Perhaps pity, perhaps amusement, perhaps simple kindness born of years in the hospitality trade. "Welcome, travelers," she said. "We have a room available if you need it and food if you can pay." Sancho produced a few coins, the last of their money carefully hoarded, and the woman nodded, satisfied. She named a price that was fair, perhaps even generous. The inn was busy that evening, every table in the common room occupied. Besides Don Quixote and Sancho, there were several other travelers. A family of 5 heading to a wedding in the next province. 2 merchants arguing quietly but intensely about wool prices and trade routes. A young couple who might have been newlyweds or might have been running away together. Their furtive glances suggested the latter. And an old soldier with a pronounced limp and a distant look in his eyes that spoke of battlefields and regrets. They all gathered in the common room for the evening meal as the light died outside. The food was simple, a thick stew of vegetables and a bit of lamb, fresh bread with real butter, ale that was more water than alcohol but welcome nonetheless. It tasted like heaven after days of meager rations. Don Quixote ate slowly, with the oddly formal manners he believed befitted a knight, even though his hands shook slightly from hunger and his hollow cheeks showed his need. After the meal, as travelers inevitably do when thrown together for an evening in a strange place, stories began. The merchants told tales of their journeys, the roads they had traveled, the cities they had seen, Barcelona and Seville and Madrid. The family spoke of the upcoming wedding with excitement. The bride was the wife's youngest sister, apparently a woman of great beauty and kindness. The feast being prepared sounded magnificent. The young couple said little, mostly gazing at each other in that way young people do when they believe they have invented love and are the first to ever feel it. And then one of the merchants, made generous by ale and full stomach, turned to Don Quixote and asked for his story. He needed no further invitation. He launched into an account of his adventures, the giants he had fought, Windmills, the vast armies he had charged through, sheep, the unjustly imprisoned men he had freed, the galley slaves, the penance he had performed in the wilderness, the mountains, the princess he had sworn to help, Dorothea. He spoke with absolute conviction, his voice rising and falling in practiced rhythms, his hands gesturing dramatically to illustrate battles and encounters. The other travelers listened with varying reactions. The merchants exchanged knowing looks. Another madman, their expressions said clearly. The family was uneasy, the father shifting protectively closer to his children, worried that this strange man might be dangerous. The young couple seemed charmed, finding romance in the idea of a wandering knight-errant. The old soldier watched Don Quixote with an expression that was harder to read, something between recognition and sorrow. When Don Quixote finished his tale with a flourish, there was a brief silence in the common room. Then the old soldier spoke, his voice rough from disuse and ale. "I was a soldier once," he said, staring into his cup. "Real soldier in the king's army, fought in campaigns across Europe, saw things no one should see, did things no one should do." He paused, took a long drink. "We told ourselves we were fighting for glory, for honor, for our king and country. We told ourselves we mattered, that our suffering had meaning. But mostly we were just young men killing other young men for reasons none of us understood, following orders we didn't question." He looked up, meeting Don Quixote's eyes directly. "You, Sir Knight, are mad. Everyone here knows it. But you fight for something you actually believe in. You choose your battles, foolish as they are, and maybe that's more than the rest of us can say. Maybe that's more honest than following orders and pretending it's noble." Don Quixote inclined his head gravely, acknowledging the words. "We are all knights of a kind, I think. We all serve something, whether we name it or not. Whether it's honor or survival or love, or simply the need to keep moving forward. The question is only whether we serve consciously or blindly." The soldier nodded slowly and returned to his ale. The evening continued, the mood lifting again. The innkeeper brought more ale and a plate of honeyed pastries, a surprising luxury. The stories kept flowing. One of the merchants, warming to the company and the drink, told a ghost story about a haunted bridge outside Toledo where travelers disappeared. The mother from the traveling family told a fairy tale to the children, who listened wide-eyed even though they had probably heard it a dozen times before. Sancho, pressed for a contribution, told a rambling story about his village, something about a pig and a priest and a wedding that went wrong. that made little logical sense but made everyone laugh anyway. As the night deepened and the fire burned low, Don Quixote began to nod off in his chair. The journey, the meal, the warmth of the fire and the ale, it was too much. His head drooped, then jerked up, then drooped again. His eyes would close and then snap open as he fought against sleep. "Take him to bed, friend," the innkeeper said kindly to Sancho, her voice gentle. "He looks ready to fall where he sits." Sancho helped his master upstairs to their small room, barely more than a closet with 2 straw mattresses on the floor and a small window that let in the night air. Don Quixote was asleep almost before Sancho had finished removing his armor, piece by difficult piece. The brass basin helmet clattered to the floor. The old knight's breathing deepened, and small snores began to fill the room. Sancho sat on his own mattress and looked at his master in the dim light filtering through the window. In sleep, Don Quixote looked his age, the lines on his face deep, his body thin and worn from hardship. There was no sign of the knight-errant now, only an elderly man exhausted by a dream he would not surrender. But as Sancho watched, Don Quixote smiled in his sleep and murmured something, Dulcinea's name, probably. Even in dreams, he was faithful to his quest, to his lady, to his vision of what a knight should be. Sancho lay down on his own mattress and pulled his cloak over himself as a blanket. Through the thin walls, he could hear the murmur of conversation continuing downstairs, the occasional burst of laughter, the slow drift towards sleep that happens in any inn as night deepens. This, Sancho thought, was what made the journey bearable, these moments between the grand delusions and disasters, these ordinary places where tired people gathered and shared food and stories, and a roof against the night. Not the quests or the battles or the impossible dreams, but the evenings in common rooms, the unexpected kindness of innkeepers, the honest exhaustion after a long day that made even a straw mattress feel like luxury. The next morning, they woke to find the inn in chaos. During the night, someone had stolen one of the merchant's saddlebags, the one containing his money and his account books. The merchant was furious, his voice echoing through the inn as he accused everyone in sight. The young couple seemed to have quarreled about something and weren't speaking, sitting at opposite ends of a table with elaborate care. The children from the traveling family were fighting over a wooden toy, their voices shrill. The innkeeper was trying to keep the peace while also preparing breakfast, her face flushed and frustrated. Don Quixote surveyed the scene and declared solemnly that he would solve the mystery of the theft. This was, he announced to the gathered company, exactly the sort of challenge a knight-errant was meant to address. A wrong to be righted, justice to be served, order to be restored from chaos. Sancho groaned internally. Here we go again, he thought. More madness, more disaster. But what followed was unexpectedly effective. Don Quixote questioned everyone with solemn courtesy and surprising thoroughness. He examined the scene of the theft like a judicial investigator, noting which window had been left open, which floorboards showed fresh scratches. He listened carefully to each person's account of the night, asking thoughtful questions. And somehow, whether through luck or an unexpected shrewdness beneath his madness, he determined that the thief was not one of the guests at all, but the innkeeper's own son, a boy of about 15 who had taken the bag on impulse in the night, intending to run away to the city, and had hidden it poorly in the stable beneath some hay. When confronted gently by Don Quixote, not with anger but with compassionate understanding, the boy broke down and confessed everything. The bag was recovered. The merchant was satisfied. The innkeeper was mortified but deeply grateful that the matter had been resolved quietly, without authorities being called or her son being arrested. Don Quixote, gracious in his small victory, suggested mercy for the boy, a reprimand and full restitution to the merchant, yes, but no harsh punishment. The boy was young, he said. Young people made foolish choices. What mattered was that he learn from this and choose better next time. Everyone agreed. The merchant got his money back and was satisfied with a stern apology. The innkeeper promised to watch her son more carefully. The boy, shamefaced but grateful, promised to work off his debt. As they prepared to leave later that morning, the innkeeper approached Don Quixote privately. "You're a strange one," she said, studying his face. "Half the time I think you're touched in the head, but you have a good heart. The world could use more strange people with good hearts." Don Quixote bowed deeply. "You've shown us great kindness, my lady. This castle of yours will remain in my memory as a place of warmth and honor." "It's an inn," she said gently, not unkindly. "Just an inn, perhaps to some," he said with a small, knowing smile. "But kindness can make any place enchanted. Generosity transforms the ordinary into something magical." As they rode away down the dusty road, Sancho looked back at the inn, utterly ordinary in the morning light. Chickens still scratching in the yard, smoke rising from the chimney where breakfast was being prepared for the remaining guests. "That went better than usual," Sancho observed cautiously. "Sometimes," Don Quixote replied, "the world cooperates with our visions. Sometimes reality and dream align, and in those moments anything seems possible. Justice is served. Good is rewarded, truth emerges." Sancho thought about that as they continued down the road, the inn shrinking behind them. Maybe his master was right. Maybe occasionally, just occasionally, the world did cooperate with the visions of madmen. Maybe all those other times, the windmills and the sheep and the spectacular disasters, were just practice for the moments when, against all odds, it all worked out. Or maybe it was all just luck and coincidence, and this one time things had happened to align. But either way, they had solved a mystery, recovered stolen goods, and left an inn a better place than they had found it. For Don Quixote, that was knight-errantry at its finest. For Sancho, it was just being decent and paying attention. Maybe in the end, they were the same thing. Their journey continued for several more weeks, Don Quixote and Sancho winding their way across the Spanish landscape like a thread through fabric. Summer had turned to autumn now, and the air carried the first hints of coming cold. The mornings were sharp and clear. The fields were brown with harvest stubble. The leaves on the remaining trees were turning gold and copper, and when the wind blew, they fell in drifting showers. And then, one bright morning as they traveled along a poplar-lined road, they encountered another knight. He appeared ahead of them, a figure in gleaming armor that caught the morning sun and threw it back in dazzling, almost blinding flashes. His horse was magnificent, black as midnight and powerful, nothing like poor old Rocinante with his protruding ribs and patient suffering. And most strikingly, most unusually, the knight's armor was decorated with small mirrors, hundreds of them carefully attached, so that he seemed to shimmer and multiply as he moved, reflecting the world around him in fragmented pieces. Don Quixote stopped immediately, his hand going instinctively to his sword. "A knight," he breathed, wonder and excitement in his voice. "A true knight by his bearing and his arms. I had begun to think we would never encounter another." Sancho squinted at the approaching figure and felt a deep unease settle in his stomach. Something about this felt wrong, staged somehow, too convenient, too perfect. The knight reined in his magnificent horse some distance away and called out in a loud, formal voice that sounded rehearsed. "I am the Knight of Mirrors, and I have sought you across half of Spain. I challenge you, Don Quixote de la Mancha." Don Quixote started visibly at hearing his own name spoken by this stranger. "You know me. All the world knows of you," the Knight of Mirrors replied with theatrical grandeur. "Your deeds have spread far and wide. Tales of your courage and your folly are told in every tavern. And I am here to prove that your lady, this Dulcinea del Toboso you speak of so constantly, cannot possibly be as beautiful as my own lady. I challenge you to combat to determine whose lady is superior. If you win, I will acknowledge Dulcinea's supremacy in all things. If I win, you must return to your village immediately and cease your knight-errantry for 1 full year." Behind the Knight of Mirrors, another figure appeared from behind a tree, his squire, a rotund man wearing a grotesquely false nose that was clearly meant as a comic exaggeration of Sancho's own round face. The squire waved mockingly, making rude gestures. Sancho felt his blood rise with anger. "Master, there's something not right about this. How does he know your name? How does he know about Dulcinea? We've been traveling in remote areas. This is too convenient. It's a trap of some kind." But Don Quixote was already accepting the challenge, his voice ringing with conviction. Honor demanded it. A slight against Dulcinea could not stand, no matter the circumstances. No matter who issued it or why. What neither of them fully realized, though Sancho suspected strongly, was that the Knight of Mirrors was actually Samson Carrasco, a young scholar from their own village. He had been sent by Don Quixote's niece, his housekeeper, the village priest, and several concerned friends with a specific plan. Defeat Don Quixote in knightly combat using his own rules and delusions, impose the condition that he return home and rest, and thus end his mad adventures before he got himself killed or caused more trouble. Samson had studied Don Quixote's patterns, his weaknesses. He had practiced for weeks. He had commissioned the mirror armor specifically to dazzle and confuse. He was younger, stronger, better trained. Victory seemed certain. The two knights prepared for battle, taking their positions at opposite ends of a clear stretch of road. It should have been quick. Samson was younger by 30 years, stronger, with better armor and a far superior horse. He had practiced his lance work. He had a solid plan based on everything he had learned about Don Quixote's fighting style from village gossip. But as they charged toward each other, lances leveled, Samson made several critical mistakes. First, he had become so caught up in playing the role, so focused on the theatrical elements of the challenge and the elaborate story he had constructed, that he forgot the basic fundamentals of actual combat. Second, he underestimated his opponent, seeing an old madman instead of a man who had been fighting, granted, often windmills and sheep for months. Third, and most fatally, his magnificent horse stumbled slightly on a rock hidden in the grass. His lance dipped at exactly the wrong moment. His balance shifted, and Don Quixote, by sheer luck or perhaps by the muscle memory of 1,000 imagined battles, by the pure conviction that he must win, struck true. The impact was solid, undeniable. Samson was unhorsed, hurled from his saddle, landing hard on the ground with a tremendous crash of armor and breaking mirrors. Don Quixote reined in Rocinante and dismounted carefully. He approached his fallen opponent with sword drawn, ready to demand surrender according to the rules of chivalric combat. Sancho rushed forward, his heart pounding. He pulled off the defeated knight's helmet and gasped. It was young Carrasco from the village, looking dazed, confused, and deeply embarrassed. Don Quixote stared down at him. For a long, heavy moment, he said absolutely nothing. The recognition was clear on his face. "Samson," he finally said, his voice quiet, "is that you beneath all this mirror work?" The young man nodded, wincing as he tried to sit up. His pride hurt worse than his body. "Yes, Don Quixote, it's me. I was sent to bring you home. To end all this, your family is worried. The village is concerned. They asked me to stop you." Don Quixote stood very still. Sancho watched his master's face carefully, trying to read his expression. This was it, the moment when reality and delusion crashed together unavoidably. Here was proof, undeniable proof, that people thought he was mad, that his own village had sent someone to stop him, that his quest was seen as a problem to be solved. But then Don Quixote spoke, and his voice was gentle, even kind. "You fought with honor, young Samson. You played your role well, took it seriously. I respect that. But you see, don't you? The knight prevails. The quest continues. That is how these stories work. That is how they must work." He offered his hand and helped Samson to his feet, supporting his weight. "Go back to the village," Don Quixote said quietly. "Tell them I am well. Tell them I am doing what I must. And tell them I know they worry and I am grateful for that worry. It shows they care, but this is my choice. My life to live as I see fit. I am harming no one, helping where I can and living according to my conscience. What more can they ask?" Samson, still shaken from the fall and the unexpected defeat, could only nod. He had failed his mission spectacularly. And worse, much worse, looking into Don Quixote's eyes, kind eyes, lucid eyes in some strange way, he wasn't entirely sure anymore that failure was the wrong outcome. There was something in the old man's face, some quality of peace or purpose, that made Samson question whether bringing him home would really be kindness or just enforced conformity. Samson and his squire gathered their broken mirrors and their bruised dignity and left, limping back toward the village with their failed plan weighing on them. Don Quixote and Sancho stood alone on the road once more, just the two of them as it had been for so long. "Master," Sancho said carefully, choosing his words like stepping stones across a river, "you knew, didn't you? You knew it was him, that it was all arranged." Don Quixote smiled slightly. "I suspected it was someone from home almost immediately. The mirrors were too perfect, too obviously designed to play on my supposed madness and vanity. The challenge was too specific. and Samson's voice, even disguised, was familiar. But it doesn't matter, Sancho. Whether he was truly a knight or a young man playing dress-up to humor a madman, the principle remains the same. Dulcinea's honor was challenged. I defended it. I prevailed. That is what matters. But they want you to come home, your family, your friends, the whole village. I know, Don Quixote said quietly with real sadness. And someday I will go home. I must eventually, but not yet. Not until the quest is complete, or until I physically cannot continue. Not until I've done what I set out to do, or at least tried my very best. And what is that, exactly? What are you actually trying to accomplish? Don Quixote looked out at the horizon, at the road stretching away into the distance, at the autumn landscape holding its breath before winter. I'm trying to prove that it's still possible, Sancho. That a person can choose to believe in something better than what they see. That nobility hasn't died from the world. That honor isn't just a word in old books gathering dust. I may be failing. I probably am failing. Most people certainly think I am, but at least I'm trying. At least I stood up and said, I will not accept the world exactly as it is, and maybe that's enough. They mounted their horses, Rocinante and the patient donkey, and continued on. The road was the same road it had always been. The world had not changed because of one small battle, but they kept moving forward. That evening, as they made camp under a stand of oak trees, Sancho noticed that Don Quixote was quieter than usual. The encounter with Samson had affected him, even if he wouldn't fully admit it. The knowledge that people were actively trying to stop him, to bring him home like a wayward child, to end his dream for his own good, it had weight. It had cost. Master, Sancho said as they sat by their small fire, do you ever regret it, starting all this? Don Quixote considered the question seriously, as he always did with Sancho's questions. He never dismissed them, never treated them as stupid, even when they challenged his core beliefs. No, he said finally, firmly. I regret some of my mistakes. I regret the times I've caused harm when I meant to help, the boy who was beaten worse after I left, perhaps the confusions and troubles I've caused. But the quest itself, the choice to become a knight, no, never. These months on the road with you, Sancho, seeing the world, trying to make it better even when I fail spectacularly, these have been the most alive I've ever felt in my entire life. Before this, I was just existing, filling empty days with meaningless routine, eating and sleeping and waiting to die. Now I'm living, truly living. Even if it's all delusion, it's a delusion that makes me feel gloriously human. Is that so wrong? Sancho had no answer to that. How could he? He simply nodded and turned his attention back to the fire. The stars came out, one by one, filling the vast sky. The night was cool but not yet cold. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, an owl called. Life continued, ordinary and eternal, indifferent to their small fire and smaller dreams. And Don Quixote sat by the flames, carefully polishing his brass basin helmet with a soft cloth, preparing it for whatever came next. Because for all the defeats and disasters, for all the windmills and the laughter and the failures, for all the people who thought he should stop and be sensible, he was still here, still believing, still trying, still seeing wonder where others saw only wind and grain. And that, perhaps, was its own kind of victory. The weeks that followed the battle with the Knight of Mirrors had a different quality to them, a change in the weather of the journey. Something had shifted in Don Quixote, though he would not have named it or acknowledged it. He still saw his quests, still believed in his calling, but there was a weariness now that had not been there before, a heaviness that no amount of rest seemed to lift. Rocinante was limping more often. The horse's age showed in every step, and no amount of rest seemed to help. Don Quixote himself moved more slowly in the mornings, his joints stiff and aching, his armor feeling heavier with every day that passed. And yet they continued, because what else was there to do but continue? They encountered a wedding party on the road, a young couple being married in a small village church, with all the community gathered to celebrate. Don Quixote and Sancho were invited to join the festivities, as all travelers were. There was food and music and dancing in the village square. Children ran between the tables. Old women gossiped in corners. Young men tried to impress young women with their dancing. Don Quixote gave a speech about love and honor that made some of the guests weep, though whether from genuine emotion or from the wine was unclear. He spoke of dedication, of faithfulness, of the sacred bond between two people who choose to walk through life together. The bride approached him afterward, her face flushed and happy. "You speak as though you understand love deeply, Sir Knight." "I understand devotion," Don Quixote replied, "which is perhaps love's truest form, to serve without expectation of reward, to give without counting the cost, to remain faithful even in absence, even in silence, even when your devotion goes unnoticed. That is what love requires." Sancho watched his master and felt his throat tighten with an emotion he could not quite name. Here was a man who had never been loved by the woman he claimed to serve, who would probably never even speak to her, who gave everything to a dream of someone who did not know he existed. Was that noble or tragic? Both, perhaps. Sancho still could not decide. They helped a farmer whose cart had broken down on a steep hill, spending half a day fixing the broken wheel and helping reload his goods. They gave their remaining money, their last few coins, to a widow whose children were hungry, their thin faces haunting Sancho's dreams that night. They stopped to bury a dead dog they found by the roadside, Don Quixote insisting with grave seriousness that all creatures deserved a proper rest, a return to the earth with dignity. These were not the grand quests from his stories. These were small things, ordinary kindnesses that would never be written in books or sung in ballads. But they were real in a way that giants and enchantments were not. They mattered to the people they helped. They changed small corners of the world in small but meaningful ways. One evening, as they sat by their fire under a sky full of stars, Sancho asked a question that had been weighing on him. "Master, what do you think will happen when we die?" Don Quixote looked up from the fire, surprised by the question. "What do you mean, Sancho? Will people remember us? Will they tell stories about Don Quixote and his loyal squire Sancho? Will ballads be written, songs sung, or will we just disappear like everyone else, forgotten within a generation?" Don Quixote was quiet for a long time, staring into the flames. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "I don't know, Sancho. Honestly, I don't know. Perhaps we will be forgotten. Perhaps that doesn't matter. We are not doing this to be remembered, to have our names live on. We are doing this because it is right, because it is necessary, because it makes life worth living while we have it. Even though most people think you're mad. Especially then," Don Quixote said firmly, "let them think what they will. I know the truth of my own heart. I know I have tried to live with honor, to help where I could, to stand for something. That is enough. It has to be enough." But was it enough? Sancho wondered silently. Was trying enough when it so often ended in failure, in mockery, in disaster? As autumn deepened into early winter, the air taking on a bitter edge, they turned, almost unconsciously, without explicitly deciding to, back toward La Mancha. They had been traveling in a wide circle for months, and now the circle was closing naturally, bringing them back toward home like water running downhill. Don Quixote did not acknowledge this directly. He still spoke of quests to come, adventures waiting over the next horizon. But his voice lacked its former conviction. His eyes were tired. The fire that had burned so bright months ago now flickered low. They stopped at another inn or castle, as Don Quixote insisted, though with less vehemence than before. The innkeeper recognized them from months earlier. "Still traveling, Don Quixote?" he asked with genuine kindness in his voice. "Still on your quest? Still seeking?" Don Quixote replied, and there was something new in his tone, a hint of doubt perhaps, or maybe just exhaustion. "Though I begin to suspect that what I seek may not exist in the form I first imagined." The innkeeper nodded wisely, as though he understood. "Sometimes the seeking is the point, friend, not the finding. The journey itself is what changes us." That night, lying on his straw mattress in the small room, Don Quixote had a strange dream. He dreamed of his library, the one his friends had burned in their misguided concern. All his books were there, whole and untouched, stacked from floor to ceiling. But when he tried to read them, when he opened the beloved volumes, the words rearranged themselves before his eyes, telling different stories than he remembered. Stories where the knights grew old and tired, and eventually stopped fighting. Where quests ended not in glory, but in quiet acceptance. Where Dulcinea was just a farm girl who never knew his name and never cared. He woke with tears on his face and did not know why. Sancho found him sitting up in the darkness, staring at the wall. "Master, are you ill?" "No," Don Quixote said quietly, "just thoughtful, just remembering and wondering." They traveled on. Days turned to weeks. The weather grew colder, frost appearing on the grass in the mornings. They wrapped themselves in their cloaks and tied them tight and kept moving forward because that was all they knew how to do. And everywhere they went, they encountered the same pattern: ordinary people living ordinary lives, facing ordinary struggles. No giants to fight, no enchantments to break. Just human beings trying to survive, to find small moments of joy in a difficult world, to love their families and do their work and hope for better days. Sometimes Don Quixote could help them, sometimes he could not. But he always tried, and Sancho thought that maybe, possibly, that was the point. Maybe trying was the only true heroism available to anyone, knight or farmer or scholar or beggar. Maybe the attempt itself was what mattered. One grey afternoon, clouds hanging low and heavy, they crested a familiar hill and saw a familiar landscape spread below them. The village, their village, the church tower rising above the clustered houses. The fields they had both known since childhood. Home. Don Quixote stopped, and Rocinante stopped gratefully beneath him. "We have returned," he said, and his voice carried both relief and regret in equal measure. "Should we go in?" Sancho asked, his heart suddenly beating faster. "Should we go home?" "Not yet," Don Quixote said after a moment. "Let us camp one more night out here under the sky. Tomorrow is soon enough for homecomings and endings." They made camp in a small grove of trees they both knew well, a place where children sometimes played, where shepherds sometimes sheltered their flocks. Don Quixote had played here as a child, reading his books in the shade. Sancho had brought his goats here years ago, before marriage and children. As darkness fell and stars appeared one by one in the clearing sky, Don Quixote spoke. "Sancho, I want to thank you." "For what, master?" "For coming with me. For not abandoning me when I gave you every reason to, when anyone sensible would have left after the first windmill. For being my friend when I was friendless, when the world saw only a madman. For believing in me, even when you did not believe in my delusions. For humoring me. For caring." Sancho felt tears prickle his eyes, hot against the cold air. "Where else would I have gone? You needed someone to keep you alive, and I needed to see if the world could be more than my small corner of it. I needed to believe that something larger was possible. We needed each other, I think." Don Quixote smiled, a gentle smile that held great sadness and great affection. "Yes, we did." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn down slowly to red embers, the smoke rising into the darkness. "Will you give it up?" Sancho asked finally, voicing the question he had been avoiding for weeks. "The knight-errantry, I mean, now that we're home." Don Quixote did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was so soft Sancho almost missed it. "I don't know. My body tells me yes, it aches and fails and begs for rest. My heart tells me no, it still dreams, still believes, still wants to fight for something better. Perhaps time will decide for me. Perhaps I will not have a choice." The fire died to ash. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, and two friends sat together in the darkness, on the edge between adventure and ordinary life, between madness and acceptance, between the dream and the waking. Tomorrow they would return to the village. There would be relief and recriminations, joy and judgment. Life would return to its familiar patterns or perhaps forge new ones. But tonight, for one last night under the open sky, they were still knight and squire, still dreamers, still believing that the world could be better than it was. And that belief, fragile and foolish as it might be, had sustained them through months of hardship. Perhaps, just perhaps, it would sustain them a little further still. The next morning dawned grey and cold, with frost on the grass and clouds hanging low over the village. They entered together, Don Quixote on Rocinante and Sancho on his faithful donkey. It was a strange homecoming, heavy with meaning that neither could fully articulate. Word of their approach had somehow spread. Perhaps a shepherd had seen them camped on the hill. Perhaps the news had travelled by that mysterious means by which small villages know everything. People lined the narrow streets to watch. The entire village had turned out, it seemed, to witness the return of their strange neighbour. Some faces showed relief, genuine happiness that the elderly gentleman had survived his mad adventure. Some showed pity, soft eyes, and gentle expressions that made Sancho's stomach clench. Some showed barely concealed amusement, neighbors whispering behind their hands. Children pointed and whispered to each other. Old women shook their heads and crossed themselves. Young men smirked. Don Quixote rode through them all with dignity, his back straight despite his exhaustion, despite the weight of their judgment. His brass basin helmet, properly secured on his head one last time, reflected the dull morning sun. He looked neither left nor right, but kept his eyes forward, focused on something only he could see. Sancho's wife was waiting at their house, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed. When she saw him approaching, her expression crumbled. She ran forward and embraced him fiercely, desperately, her body shaking. Then she stepped back and slapped him hard across the face, the sound echoing in the sudden silence. "Fool," she said, crying openly now, "leaving me alone all these months, with the children and the fields and everything. For what? For this madness, for this fantasy." "I'm sorry," Sancho said, touching his stinging cheek. "Truly, I'm sorry, but I had to go. I can't explain it better than that. I needed to." She looked at him, really looked at him for the first time, and saw something different in his face. Sancho had left certain things, himself, his life, his limits, and returned as something else. Older, yes, sadder perhaps, but also larger somehow, as though he had grown into a shape that could hold more than before. More experience, more understanding, more capacity for wonder. She saw it. She didn't understand it, but she saw it. She embraced him again, this time more gently. "Welcome home, you fool," she whispered. "My fool." Don Quixote continued to his own house, where his niece waited on the doorstep with the village priest and the barber. The real barber, not the one whose basin he had taken months ago. They helped him dismount, supporting his weight as his legs proved unsteady. They led him inside carefully, treating him like fragile glass. They removed his armor piece by piece, revealing the thin, exhausted man beneath, so much thinner than when he had left, his clothes hanging loose, his bones showing. "Uncle," his niece said, weeping, embracing him carefully. "You're home, finally home. We were so worried." "Yes," Don Quixote said quietly, his voice flat. "I am home." They put him to bed in his old room. He slept for 2 days straight, barely waking even to eat or drink. His niece sat beside him through it all, watching his chest rise and fall, terrified each breath might be the last. When he finally woke properly on the 3rd morning, something had changed. The fever of adventure that had burned in his eyes was gone. The certainty that had sustained him on the road had evaporated like morning dew under the harsh light of reality. He asked to see his room, the one where his library had once been. His niece helped him walk there, supporting his weight. The walls were still there, solid stone as they had always been, but they were empty now. His books were gone, his dreams reduced to ash and memory. Even the smell of them, leather and paper and old ink, had faded. He sat in that empty room for hours on a simple chair, staring at nothing, saying nothing. His niece brought food and water, but he barely touched them. Days passed in this way. Don Quixote recovered some of his physical strength, eating again, walking unaided. But a different kind of weakness had taken root in him, something deeper and more fundamental. He no longer spoke of quests or giants. He no longer polished his armor. It sat forgotten in a corner, gathering dust like everything else. The brass basin helmet, once his pride and his symbol, lay forgotten under his bed where he had kicked it. The light had gone out of him. That was what his niece thought, watching him. The light that had burned so bright, too bright, had simply extinguished. Sancho visited every day without fail. He would arrive after finishing his work in the fields, smelling of earth and honest labor. They would sit together in Don Quixote's room or sometimes in the courtyard when the weather permitted, sometimes talking, sometimes not. The silence between them was heavy with words they could not find, memories they could not share with anyone else. One morning, several weeks after their return, as autumn was giving way to winter, Sancho arrived to find the village doctor leaving Don Quixote's house. The old man's face was grave, his bag heavy in his hand. "What's wrong?" Sancho demanded, fear clutching his heart with icy fingers. "What's happened?" "Your master is dying," the doctor said simply, bluntly, with the honesty of someone who dealt with death daily. "His body is giving out. Perhaps it's the hardship of the road catching up with him. Perhaps it's age, he's not a young man, perhaps it's something else. A loss of will, perhaps, but he is dying, days, perhaps a week. No more than that. Sancho didn't wait to hear more. He rushed inside, taking the stairs 2 at a time despite his own aching knees. Don Quixote was in bed, propped up on pillows, looking very small in the large bed, very old. Very fragile, but his eyes were clear, clearer than Sancho had seen them in months, perhaps years. "Ah, Sancho," Don Quixote said, and his voice was weak but warm. "My good friend, I'm glad you're here. I hoped you would come. Master, the doctor says." "I know what he says, and he's right." Don Quixote smiled faintly. "Doctors are usually right about these things, I've found, so with me, please. I have things to say, and time is short." Sancho sat in the chair beside the bed, taking Don Quixote's thin hand in his own rough, work-calloused one. The hand felt like paper, like it might tear if he held it too tightly. "I want to apologize," Don Quixote said, "for everything, for the madness, for dragging you into my delusions, for the dangers and hardships I exposed you to, for the time I stole from you and your family." "Don't," Sancho said, tears already falling, hot on his cold cheeks. "Please don't apologize. It was the greatest adventure of my life." "Was it?" Don Quixote looked genuinely curious, genuinely uncertain, even though it was all built on madness, on delusion, on lies I told myself. "Especially because of that," Sancho said fiercely. "You showed me that the world could be more than what I could see from my small corner of it. You showed me that believing in something, even something impossible, can give life meaning. You were mad, yes, but you were also the best man I've ever known, the kindest, the bravest in your own way." Don Quixote's eyes closed. Tears leaked from under the lids, running down into the hollows of his cheeks. "I must confess something, Sancho, something important. I am myself again. The madness has lifted like a fog burning off in sunlight. I see clearly now. There were no giants, only windmills standing in fields, grinding grain as they always have. No enchantments, only ordinary things being ordinary. And Dulcinea, sweet Dulcinea del Toboso, was only Aldonza Lorenzo, a farm girl with rough hands who never knew my name, who probably wouldn't have cared if she had." Sancho's heart broke. Actually broke, like something physical tearing inside his chest. This was what he had wanted once, wasn't it? For his master to see reason, to come back to reality. But now that it had happened, it felt like a terrible loss, like watching something beautiful die. "Does it matter?" Sancho asked desperately, gripping the frail hand tighter. "Does any of that matter? You did good things, you helped people, you lived with honor, you tried to make the world better. But it was all based on delusion. On lies, and what isn't?" Sancho argued, his voice rising, becoming almost angry. "Everyone has their delusions, master. Everyone believes in things that make no logical sense. Love, hope, God and saints and heaven. Dreams of better days. How is your delusion any worse than theirs? At least yours made you kind. At least yours made you generous. At least yours made you try to make the world better instead of just accepting it as it is." Don Quixote opened his eyes and looked at Sancho with deep, abiding affection. "Thank you, my friend. You have been truer to me than I could ever have hoped, truer than I deserved." They sat in silence for a long while, just breathing together. The room was quiet except for the sound of wind against the windows and the distant sounds of village life continuing outside. Children playing, dogs barking, normal life flowing on. Outside the window, the world continued to turn. Children played in the street, their voices bright with laughter. Merchants sold their wares in the market square. The world turned on its axis, indifferent to one old man's dying dream. "Sancho," Don Quixote said finally, his voice very weak now, barely more than a whisper, "will you tell me about our adventures, as you remember them, one last time?" And so Sancho did. He told stories of windmills that became giants in the telling, of sheep that transformed into vast armies, of a brass basin that shone like purest gold in the Spanish sun. He told of mountains and inns and fellow travelers who became friends. He told of friendship and laughter and unlikely victories against impossible odds. And as he spoke, Don Quixote smiled, listened with his eyes closed, remembered, held onto those memories like treasures. "It was a good dream," Don Quixote whispered when the stories wound down. "Wasn't it, Sancho? It was a beautiful dream while it lasted." "The best dream," Sancho said, his voice breaking completely now. The very best. Don Quixote's breathing had become shallow, labored. His hand, resting in Sancho's, was very light, almost weightless, as though he was already half gone. "Don't stop dreaming, Sancho," he said, each word an effort. "Promise me, don't let the world tell you that dreams are foolish. Don't let them convince you that practical is the same as right, that safe is the same as good." "I promise," Sancho said. "I promise. Tell my niece. Tell her I was happy. In the end, despite everything, I chose how I would live. I chose my own story. That matters. That has to matter." "It does," Sancho said. It matters so much." Don Quixote smiled one last time, a smile of such peace that it transformed his worn face. "Thank you," he whispered, "for riding with me, for believing in me, for being the squire to my knight, for seeing the giants too, even when you knew they were windmills." And then, quietly, like a candle finally burning down after a long night, like a story reaching its natural end, he was gone. Sancho sat for a long time in that quiet room, holding that light, frail hand that was already growing cold, and wept for his friend, for the dream, for the beautiful madness that had changed his life forever. And so our story of Don Quixote comes to rest, like an old soldier finally laying down his sword, like a wanderer finally arriving home. They buried him in the village cemetery, beneath a simple stone that bore only his true name, whatever it had been. Not Don Quixote, just a man who had lived and died like every other man, but Sancho knew differently. He kept watch beside the grave long after the others had left, long after the sun had set and the stars had emerged. And he spoke to his friend one last time. "They think you were mad," Sancho said to the darkness. "They think you wasted your final years on delusion, but I know the truth. You lived more fully in those months than most people live in their entire lives. You chose meaning over comfort. You chose to try over accepting defeat, and that made all the difference." In the weeks that followed, life returned to its rhythms. Sancho went back to his fields, to his family, to the ordinary work of ordinary days. But he was not the same. He could not be. He had ridden with a knight. He had seen the world through different eyes. And even though he knew the giants had been windmills, even though he knew Dulcinea had been a dream, the experience had changed something fundamental in him. When his children asked about his journey, he told them stories. Sometimes he told the truth, the windmills and the sheep and the desperate confusion. But sometimes, just sometimes, he told it the way Don Quixote had seen it. Giants and enchantments and noble quests. Because both versions were true in their way. One evening, as an old man himself years later, Sancho sat with his grandchildren around the fire. They begged for a story, as children do, and Sancho told them about Don Quixote. He told them about a man who refused to accept the world as it was, who saw possibility where others saw only limitation, who chose to believe in something beautiful even when the world laughed, who fought for justice even when the battles were against his own confusion, who never stopped trying even when he always seemed to fail. "Was he really a knight, grandfather?" one child asked. Sancho thought about that. About armor and brass basins, about enchantments and ordinary things, about the difference between truth and truth. "Yes," he said finally, "he was really a knight, the truest knight I ever knew, and perhaps that was the greatest truth of all. Because Don Quixote had shown that knighthood was not about birth or training or even sanity. It was about choice. The choice to stand for something, the choice to try to make the world better. The choice to dream, even when dreaming was dangerous. The world is full of windmills, that will always be true. They stand in fields, their great arms turning, grinding grain, utterly ordinary and utterly indifferent to our interpretations of them. But the world is also full of Don Quixotes, people who look at those windmills and see possibility, who refuse to accept that ordinary is all there is, who tilt at impossible odds because someone must, because trying matters more than succeeding, because the act of believing changes the believer. Some of them end in failure, some of them end in mockery, some of them end as Don Quixote did, return to reason to see their dreams revealed as delusions. But for a time, oh, for a time, they live, they burn bright. They show the rest of us that transformation is possible, that imagination is its own kind of truth. Don Quixote's story ends here, but his questions remain. His challenge remains. What do you see when you look at the windmills in your own life? Do you see only mechanisms, only practical explanations, only the grinding of grain and the turning of wheels? Or do you see giants? Do you see challenges worth fighting? Do you see opportunities for meaning? Both visions are available to you. The world is what we make of it. Reality is what we choose to acknowledge. Don Quixote chose enchantment. He chose to see castles in inns and ladies, in farm girls and quests in ordinary journeys. Was he wrong? Was he mad? Perhaps, probably. But he was also awake in a way that most people never manage. He engaged with life instead of simply enduring it. He chose his story instead of letting one be chosen for him. And in the end, when death came gently to his bedside, he had lived in a way that meant something, to himself, to Sancho, to everyone who encountered his strange, beautiful madness. There are worse ways to live. There are safer ways, certainly, more sensible ways, ways that earn less mockery and fewer bruises. But there are few ways that matter more. Sleep now with these thoughts. Let Don Quixote's story settle into your dreams. Let it ask its quiet questions. Let it suggest that maybe, just maybe, the giants you see are as real as the windmills others insist they must be. Tomorrow is another day. You will wake. The world will be there, solid and ordinary, full of its usual demands and disappointments. But you will also wake with the memory of a thin old man in tarnished armor who refused to surrender his vision of something better, who chose to quest when settling would have been easier, who died having truly lived. Carry him with you. Carry his courage, his folly, his unshakable belief that one person choosing to care can make a difference, however small. The world needs its dreamers, its questioners, its gentle madmen who see giants and tilt their lances anyway. Perhaps it needs them most of all. Good night, rest well, and when you wake, look around you with new eyes. The windmills are waiting, the giants are waiting. The choice, as it was for Don Quixote, as it has always been, is yours alone to make.